Kenneth Allen McDuff was a notorious American serial killer who spent his life mired in sociopathy and violence. His methods of murder were extremely brutal, with shooting and strangulation being his usual methods. However, torturing his victims was the only way to satisfy his perverted desires. He is also known as the Broomstick Killer, due to the fact that in his first serial murder, he strangled a female victim with a broomstick. On March 21, 1946, in a hospital in the small town of Rosebud, Texas, a couple welcomed their fifth child, whom they named Kenneth. The town of Rosebud is sparsely populated, with just over 1,000 permanent residents. Kenneth's family is undoubtedly one of the more affluent in the area, with his father working in the construction industry as a concrete processor, and the building boom in Texas in the 1960s made his father's business extremely profitable. His mother, on the other hand, ran a self-service laundromat in the town, which also did very well. Kenneth grew up with a lot of attention and pampering from his family, where he didn't have to take on any responsibilities or follow any code of conduct. But the strangest of all is his mother and three sisters, who treat Kenneth as if he was a god, doting on him and indulging him without any boundaries. Kenneth's mom is quite the aggressive person. She's tall and known in the town for her tough, domineering temper. With such a mother, Kenneth often took pleasure in bullying his classmates and intimidating his teachers at school because he believed that no matter what wrong he committed, his mom would step in and help him out. Once, when Kenneth was punished at school, his mother rushed to the school with a pistol in her hand to defend him, so she became known as the gun-toting mom. The cause of his violent behavior is not only his mother's overindulgence, but also the influence of his older brother, Lonnie, who is the real troublemaker in the family. With his violent temper and bad behavior, and once he even took out a knife to threaten the principal, so that in his daily contact, Kenneth follows his example and gradually becomes violent. Kenneth's sixth-grade teacher mentioned something strange in an interview. At the time, she called Kenneth into the office to ask why he was always getting into trouble. Kenneth just sat quietly on his stool without saying a word, and no matter what the teacher asked him, he didn't respond at all. He just sat there looking down, avoiding eye contact with the teacher, which she thought was strange because it was extremely unusual for a young boy. In the school's IQ test, Kenneth scored a 92. In fact, he wasn't the smartest student in the class, but he was passionate about catching the attention of others. For example, when the test results came out, if he got the lowest score in the class, he'd make sure everyone knew about it. He'd even make bad jokes just to show that he didn't care about his grades. In 8th grade, Kenneth's arrogance, which had been encouraged by his family, was completely crushed. At the time, he had a very bad reputation at school and was largely disliked. So he decided to challenge Tommy, who was one of the most popular boys in the school. Kenneth felt that if he could beat Tommy, it would gain him a lot of respect. He wanted people's attention and recognition. Tommy was a jock and had a very humble personality. That day, Kenneth purposely bumped into him in the hallway and kept insulting him and calling him a hypocrite. Tommy was so aggravated that he couldn't stand it anymore and agreed to Kenneth's challenge. They arranged to fight by the drainage ditch after school. Word spread quickly throughout the school that the school's most popular and least popular students were going to fight. So as soon as the bell rang, a large group of people gathered around to watch. But the fight only lasted a few minutes because, although Kenneth was big, he wasn't strong and hadn't been trained to do anything more than bite. But Tommy worked out every day and was so strong that he easily knocked Kenneth into the drain. From that day on, Kenneth was quiet. He never bothered his classmates or got into any annoying pranks. After a few months, he couldn't stand the strange looks from the people around him. He dropped out of school and then went to work for his father doing some manual labor. Perhaps because Kenneth worked for his father for several years, he became bolder and bolder, which led him to dare to commit serious crimes at the age of 18. It was one night in 1964 when Kenneth was drunk and feeling sexual urges. He sneaked into a house and raped a woman. To make sure she didn't call the police, he took a knife and slit her throat, then dumped her in a drainage ditch. When he got home, he told Lonnie what had happened. Lonnie was totally cool about it and told him to go to bed and forget about it. And the victim didn't die after being dumped in the gutter. She was rushed to the hospital for resuscitation in a very short time. Some people say that after Kenneth raped her, she got pregnant and gave birth to the baby. A few weeks later, Kenneth was arrested for burglary, but not the rape of a woman and attempted murder. He was charged with 12 counts of burglary and attempted burglary and sentenced to 12 four-year prison terms, or a total of 48 years. However, After serving just under a year of his sentence, his application for parole was approved. At this point, Kenneth's heart goes through some subtle changes as he believes he has become more emboldened and doesn't give a damn about the law because he not only committed a dozen burglaries, but even raped and murdered a woman, but was paroled after only a year in prison. So he started getting involved in some of the crazy schemes he came up with, targeting some of the thinner and more timid people. One of them was Roydale Green, an employee of Kenneth's father who lived with his mother. Once, Kenneth showed some of his cruel pranks in Green's mother's bedroom, including nailing a girl to the floor and inserting a syringe filled with hot water into her body. Green was 2 years younger than Kenneth and lacked much life experience, so he was easily mesmerized by Kenneth's stories of sadistic sex. Kenneth also bragged that he had raped and strangled a couple of women. He told him that killing a woman was as easy as killing a chicken, which he wasn't too convinced of until a few months later when an incident occurred. On August 6, 1966, Kenneth and Green were working at a construction site in Temple. They were pouring concrete that morning. When they finished the job, they cleaned up the site, and then Kenneth drove Green to Fort Worth in the new Dodge Charger his mother had given him when he got out of prison. Green has never been to Fort Worth, but since Kenneth worked there a couple of years before and said he knew some girls there, he's going to show Green the ropes. So the two of them are driving around Everman just south of Fort Worth, drinking beer and visiting friends, including a girl Kenneth met at church. That night, after dropping the girl off at home, Kenneth saw the girl he was looking for. She was pretty, wearing a red and white striped shirt and cut-off jeans and driving a 1955 Ford. She was standing near the baseball field talking to two boys. The three were Edna Sullivan, 16 years old, Robert Brand, 17 years old, who is Sullivan's boyfriend, and Mark Dunham, 15 years old, Robert's cousin, who was visiting relatives from California. At that time, Kenneth had a .38 caliber handgun in his hand and stepped out of the car to approach the three young teenagers, while Green sat quietly in the car looking them. Kenneth first demanded that the three young teenagers hand over their wallets and then proceeded to, he forced them, with the gun in his hand, to get into the trunk of the car and lock them in it. Kenneth then explained to Green, saying, "I was just going to rob them, but they all had a good look at my face, so I just had to kill them." Kenneth drove Sullivan's Ford slowly down the dark country roads while Green followed in Kenneth's Dodge. Green was still wondering if Kenneth really intended to hurt the hostages. About half an hour later, Kenneth took a side road into a field where he stopped the car and opened the trunk. He then said, "I want this young lady to come out," and grabbed Sullivan by the arm, pulling her out forcefully. Kenneth ordered Green to lock her in the trunk of the Dodge, and the two boys stayed in the trunk of the Ford, begging Kenneth to spare their lives. But Kenneth responded only with his actions. He raised his pistol to the boys' heads and pulled the trigger. Brand was shot twice in the head and died at the scene. His cousin Mark was shot 3 times and didn't die until Kenneth fired again. Green saw the gunfire and covered his ears and eyes. When he looked back, he saw Kenneth's expression, which seemed calm and content. It seemed to say, "What do you think so far, Green?" And then Kenneth parked the Ford next to the fence on the side road and left the scene with Green in the Dodge with a terrified Sullivan in the trunk. They drove away from the Johnson County line, heading south, and then stopped on a dirt road about 11 miles from where they had left the Ford and the two boys. Kenneth first opened the trunk and released Sullivan, who he ordered to remove her clothes. He then threw her into the back seat and raped her, violating her twice before he forced Green to do the same. Throughout this entire process, Green remembers only one thing Sullivan said: "I think you ripped something." Once Kenneth had let off some steam, he drove down a gravel road again. 10 minutes later, he pulled up at a side road and got out of the car to drag Sullivan to the front. He sat her down on the ground. Green wasn't sure what Kenneth was planning to do next, but he quickly saw Kenneth force Sullivan's head to the ground and then strangle her with a broom handle. Kenneth was holding her so tightly that his arms were bulging with veins, while Sullivan was flailing her arms and kicking her legs in an attempt to break free. Green was told to grab her legs, and when he did, Kenneth ended her life for good. They then dumped Sullivan's body in the bush next to the trail and drove home, stopping again on the way to bury the purses belonging to the two boys and then discarding their own blood-stained clothes as well. The next afternoon, while Green was driving around with a friend, the news about the murders came on the car's radio. He was so shaken up by the news that he immediately knew he had to tell someone what he knew. At the time, the murder was called the Broomstick Murders, which is where Kenneth got his nickname. Green eventually told the police what happened, even though he was involved in the murder, but he only got 25 years in prison because he became a key witness for the prosecution. Kenneth, on the other hand, was sentenced to death, but he was not executed because, in 1972, something happened that shocked the entire United States, and that was Furman v. Georgia case. To put it simply, one man was sentenced to death for murder and 2 others for sexual assault. They complained that the sentences were inconsistent with the 8th Amendment of the Constitution, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. At the time, the U.S. Supreme Court was unanimous in its opinion that the death penalty was unconstitutional in these cases. This led to a nationwide moratorium on executions, with 629 death row inmates having their death sentences commuted to life imprisonment. Kenneth was one of them. He then often applied for parole and also tried to bribe a parole member in 1981, but he was caught and sentenced to 2 years in prison for the bribe. Around 1986, overcrowding in prisons became an issue in Texas, so the governor of the state pressured. He asked the parole board to release 750 inmates a week. In 1989, 2 of the 3 parole board members decided that since Kenneth had started taking college classes, he was someone who could still contribute to society. They decided to grant Kenneth parole. When Kenneth was released from prison on October 11th, several young women in Central Texas went missing. They were found dead in almost the same manner, and it was suspected that Kenneth was responsible for their deaths. The first victim was Seraphia Minetta Parker, a 29-year-old sex worker. She was found in a remote field in Temple, Texas, on October 14th, which was the 3rd day after Kenneth's release from prison. Her autopsy report showed that she had many traces of being beaten and strangled. As the time approached, Kenneth was suspected of being the murderer. Denise Janine Mason was a 20-year-old sex worker whose body was found in Austin. Her autopsy report also showed signs of beatings and strangulation marks on her body, and Kenneth was considered a suspect in this case, but there was no definitive evidence to confirm that he was the killer. In July, Kenneth was sent back to prison for violating his parole, because he had been yelling racial slurs at a group of black teenagers and then chasing and threatening one of them with a knife. His mother paid more than $2,000 to pay off an attorney. So, on December 18th, he was released from prison again. On October 10th, 1991, 36-year-old Brenda Thompson disappeared in Waco. Later that night, Kenneth was pulled over by a police officer on the highway. While he was being questioned by the officer, another officer heard some strange noises near the car. Then he saw through the window that there was a woman inside the car who was kicking the windshield over and over again. Her hands and feet were bound. Her mouth was gagged, and when the officer was just about to get his gun to warn him, Kenneth started the vehicle straight through the roadblock, and the 3 officers gave chase, but Kenneth was smart enough to turn off his headlights and escape the police. Eventually, Kenneth parked his car in a nearby wooded area and tortured Thompson to death. Just 5 days later, 17-year-old Regina Deanne Moore also went missing. She was last seen getting into Kenneth's car at a motel. She screamed and kicked at the glass repeatedly in the car. Eventually, she was raped and strangled. On December 29, 1991, Colleen Ann Reed, a 28-year-old certified public accountant, was abducted by Kenneth from an Austin car wash. 3 witnesses heard her screaming and saw Kenneth's car speeding away from the car wash, and they also found Colleen's car abandoned at the car wash. On the night of February 24, 1992, Valencia K. Joshua, a 22-year-old sex worker from Fort Worth, who went to the same college as Kenneth, Texas Tech, went missing. She was last seen knocking on Kenneth's dormitory window. On March 25th, her body was found in a shallow grave on a golf course near the university, and the cause of death was strangulation. On February 29, 1992, 22-year-old Melissa Ann Northup mysteriously disappeared while working at the Quick Pack store in Waco, when she was not only pregnant, but also a mother of 2. Melissa had originally expressed concerns about the store's security measures, and the day of her disappearance coincided with her last shift at work. Later that evening, her husband rushed to the store after several failed attempts to reach her by phone, only to find the store empty, $250 missing from the cash register, and Melissa's 1977 Buick Regal missing. Since Kenneth used to work at the store, when the police learned that Melissa had disappeared that night near the store, they named Kenneth as their primary suspect straight away. By this time, Kenneth had moved to Missouri, where he paid for a new car and a fake ID, and became a garbage collector under the name Richard Fowler. The police first questioned several of Kenneth's friends, including 34-year-old Alva Hank Worley. After several interviews, on April 20th, 1992, Worley admitted that he and Kenneth had worked together to kidnap Colleen. It turned out that Colleen's death was an accident. Worley and Kenneth had originally planned to go buy drugs, but while passing through a car wash, Kenneth spotted Colleen. So they managed to kidnap her and drove north to Belton, Texas, where Kenneth and Worley took turns assaulting her and knocking her unconscious before murdering her on a dirt road. Melissa's body was found floating in a gravel pit in Dallas County on April 26th. She had been strangled, and her hands were still tied tightly when she was found. Once the police found Melissa's body, they quickly set up a search party and let the public know that Kenneth was wanted for a string of murders in Texas over the past few years. On May 3, 1992, Kenneth's co-worker looked at the photos on America's Most Wanted. The more he looked at them, the more he thought Kenneth looked like his co-worker Richard Fowler, who was on the wanted list. So he decided to report this to the police. After the police got the tip, they first looked into Richard Fowler's background. They found out that he'd been arrested before for looking for a sex worker and that his fingerprints had been collected. So the police compared his fingerprints with those of Kenneth, and it turned out that they were the same person. Kenneth was arrested on May 4th while driving to a landfill in Kansas City, Kansas. One reporter had written in 1992 that this time, God willing, the system would do the right thing, and if the death penalty needed a good reason, it was Kenneth. In February 1993, he was tried for Melissa's murder. The prosecutors highlighted the similarities between Melissa's and Colleen's cases, even getting Worley to testify that he was involved in Colleen's kidnapping to incriminate Kenneth. Kenneth was ultimately convicted of Melissa's murder and sentenced to death. In April, Kenneth was accused of kidnapping, raping, and murdering Colleen. Even though her body hadn't been found, an eyewitness said he was one of the kidnappers, and he also said Kenneth's car matched the one seen. The hairs found in the car matched Colleen's. So on February 23, 1994, Kenneth was convicted on all charges. On March 1st, he was sentenced to death again. But for some reason, prosecutors didn't charge him with Valencia's murder. A few days later, Kenneth was taken out of the death row. The police asked him to help find the victim's body. He led the police to find Colleen's body. But however, Kenneth chose to abandon the search for the remains of Thompson and Regina because he wanted to delay his execution, but the plan did not succeed. In the end, on September 29, 1998, Regina's body was found in McLennan County, and then Thompson's body was also found in McLennan County on October 3rd. On November 17, 1998, Kenneth received a lethal injection that ended his life. His last words before he died were, "I'm ready to be released. Let go of me." At the end of the story, Kenneth's family, who doted on Kenneth, did not claim Kenneth's body, and then prison officials buried him in Captain Joe Bird Cemetery, where his headstone bears only the date of his execution and the number of his death row cell. David Parker Ray was a suspected serial killer who was convicted in the United States on charges of serial rape, kidnapping, and torture. He was also known as the Toy Box Killer because he spent around $100,000 on a trailer and converted it into a torture chamber. There were all kinds of tools for torturing his victims, such as whips, chains, pulleys, clamps, belts, leg hangers, and scalpel blades. And he even installed a homemade generator to electrocute and torture his victims. Most serial killers are not known to their family and friends until they are arrested for their criminal activities, but David's lover, daughter, and friend were his accomplices who were responsible for helping him find as well as kidnap his victims, and were even directly involved in the process of the murders. Before his crimes were fully exposed, his neighbors and friends said he always seemed like an ordinary guy, and his actions and appearance never hinted at the dark and cruel side he kept hidden. David was born on November 6, 1939, in Belen, Valencia County, New Mexico. It's an area with a pretty high crime rate. In fact, modern statistics show that about 1 in 50 local residents will be the victim of a serious crime. His father was Cecil Leland Ray, a mechanic who was supposed to lead a good life. However, he was both a drinker and abusive to his loved ones. As a result, his first wife, David's mother, Nettie Opal Parker, often fought with him. They got divorced when David was only 10 years old. Because his parents didn't get along, David and his sister grew up with their maternal grandparents. Unfortunately, David's grandmother had a mental illness and treated David as if he were her son, and she raised David and his sister in an extremely old-fashioned, strict manner. His father, a violent alcoholic, has never made any changes, even though he often doesn't see his children and his wife is going to choose to divorce him. And when he was drunk, he would sometimes go to see his 2 kids and bring magazines with pornographic images that were abusive. As everyone knows, kids who are raised with strict discipline and abuse often have psychological problems, and David is no exception. He had low self-esteem and was introverted during his high school years. When he was around girls, he often found himself too shy to speak. But often such a person would suffer from the taunts and hurt of his peers, so he began to use alcohol and drugs as his way to go to escape reality. Dark fantasies of raping, torturing, and even murdering women developed as early as his teenage years. There were 2 most fundamental reasons for this. The first being that his father had instilled pornography in him during his childhood, and the second being due to his curiosity and low self-esteem about women during puberty. When he was 14, his 11-year-old sister stumbled upon drawings of sadomasochism and pornographic images of a kidnapping nature that he had hidden under his bed, leading to an estrangement between them. After graduating from high school, David joined the U.S. Army, and after his discharge, he worked as a mechanic by trade and then as a maintenance man for the State Parks Department in Truth or Consequences, a job that didn't end until after he was arrested for murder. There were several bars in the area with a very chaotic environment, and he frequented them looking for potential victims, and sex workers, alcoholics, and women of low social status were his targets. His first murder has always remained a mystery, as no one has been able to locate the alleged first unidentified victim. But in a recorded message, he even said that he had been sexually assaulting women since he was a child, and had revealed to his first wife that he had committed the first murder of his life at the age of 18. But no matter how hard the police and detectives tried, they were never able to confirm that this claim was true. David's base of operation was his soundproofed cargo trailer where he kept many sex toys, torture tools, syringes, and even detailed charts with different methods of torturing his victims, and a mirror mounted on the ceiling of the trailer which he said allowed his victims to see themselves being tortured. And inside the trailer, he also had a carefully modified wooden device into which he would lock his victims, bend them over with their buttocks exposed, and restrain them before allowing his dogs and some of his friends to rape them. While the victims were being physically abused, he would also play a tape designed to break down their psychological defenses by saying, "I like to play mind games. When we are completely finished with you, you will be injected with a series of hypnotic drugs, which will make you highly susceptible to hypnosis, auto-hypnosis, and hypnotic suggestion. And over the course of the days, you will be injected with a continuous stream of the drugs as I play with your body and mind, and when it's all over, you won't remember a damn thing about this place." David abducts several women every year and holds them captive for 2 or 3 days at a time. How many people he has raped, tortured, and murdered over the years is unknown, as most of his victims basically have a nervous breakdown after the ordeal. So no one bothered to report his crimes, and the police have found no evidence of anyone else being murdered. As to why there is speculation that he has murdered many people, it is because he had a diary, and the diary detailed what he did to each of his victims. And his accomplices also said that the murdered victims were buried in a nearby ravine after being dismembered, or in a lake. David had a total of 3 accomplices, the first being his daughter Glenda Zhang Ray, who in 1986 tried to expose David to the police for kidnapping and torturing women and selling them to buyers in Mexico. But the operation was not carried out because the allegations were too vague and there was no evidence of actuality. For some unknown reason, she became involved in his criminal activities a few years later. The second was Cindy Hendy, who at the time was fleeing a conviction for grand theft and drug charges in Washington state, and then decided to work at a state park in Truth or Consequences where David worked. And then, the two quickly developed a romantic relationship over their shared violent sexual fantasies. The third is his friend Dennis Roy Yancey. On the evening of the 22nd of March, 1999, 22-year-old Cynthia Vigil, bleeding from a head wound and wearing a metal collar around her neck, ran through the streets in an exaggerated state, and although she screamed for help, passing cars were afraid to approach her in her frantic state. Desperate and on the verge of a nervous breakdown, Cynthia kept looking back, fearing that her captors were always behind her. And then she spotted a house with an open door at the side of the road and immediately ran inside and shut the door behind her. After observing the layout of the house, she breathed a sigh of relief and begged the owner to help her. Fortunately, the homeowner saw her head injury and immediately called the police and emergency services. By this time, Cynthia's hair was covered in blood and she was cowering on the floor crying. When the police were called, she screamed hysterically, "I'm alive." Come and help me." After screaming for a while, she calmed down and told the police in detail what had really happened. It turned out that she was a sex worker when David drove up to her in a car park and offered her $20 to go to his trailer for a service. By the time she got into David's car, she realized there was someone else in the car, and that was Cindy. She sensed a trap, but there was no way for her to escape. David and Cindy immediately bound and gagged her, then took her into the trailer and chained her to a post by the bed. During the 3 days she was there, she was subjected to a series of tortures, including humiliation with sex toys, electrocution, hanging in the air, and being threatened with a gun, as well as being sexually assaulted on several occasions. The opportunity to escape soon presented itself, however, as David had to go to work and asked Cindy to watch her before he left the trailer. She then waited until Cindy had gone into a side room to rest, got the key and unlocked the chains. There was a telephone next to the desk, and she tried to call the police, but Cindy heard a ringing noise. She took a lamp and smashed it directly over Cynthia's head. Cynthia was knocked down, but there was a box with an ice pick next to her box, so she picked up the ice pick to try and protect herself. Cindy stared nervously at the weapon in Cynthia's hand, and then took a step back the room, but this gave Cynthia just enough distance to open the door and escape. After giving the police the location of David's trailer, she was taken to hospital. There, she was covered in wounds that shocked everyone. Her neck had a ring of strangulation marks from the collar, and her body was covered in burn marks from the electric shock. A few hours later, David and Cindy were arrested, and during their interrogation they stammered and explained that they had been trying to help Cynthia kick her terrible drug habit. And while this had a certain amount of credibility, the police weren't prepared to let the two would-be criminals off the hook. The police soon obtain a search warrant, and if they find the tools of the crime in the trailer, they will be able to expose David and Cindy's lies. The police then found a gun and a broken lamp in the trailer, as well as an assortment of medical equipment and items used to administer electric shocks, in addition to a number of true crime items such as the pole Cynthia was chained to and the ice pick she used to confront Cindy with a tape recording used to intimidate the victim. Eventually, both David and Cindy were taken into custody and charged with 12 counts of kidnapping, aggravated assault, and murder, and their bail was set at $1 million each. But even with all this evidence, it wasn't easy to convict them. Soon the case against David got more help. When the incident was reported in the newspapers, a victim called Angelica Montano told police that she had suffered a similar ordeal a month earlier, saying that she was a friend of theirs and had entered their home on the 17th of February looking for cake mix before David took a knife and told her she had been kidnapped. Apparently the painful ordeal took place and she was tied up, stripped naked, and then put on a metal collar, followed by a series of abuses. This lasted for 3 days in total, as on the 4th day she managed to persuade them to let her go and they left her on a local motorway. Luckily, a policeman rescued her, but when she told him about it, he didn't believe her and let her go when they got to a bus stop, thinking she was just crazy. According to a source, Cindy had told a friend that she had taken part in David's crimes under the influence of alcohol because it gave her an adrenaline rush. And she confided in this person that 4 to 6 people had been killed, dismembered, and thrown into a nearby lake. Although he doesn't quite believe Cindy, he decides to tell the story to the police. In the end, Cindy is willing to sign a plea bargain with the prosecutor, and in exchange for a significant reduction in her sentence, she provides extensive details about David's murder, and also reveals that Glenda, David, and Yancey were involved in the murder of a young woman together. Her name was Sylvia Marie Parker, and at the time of her disappearance she was only 22 years old and the mother of 2 young children, and then investigators quickly located Yancey, who was 27 years old, and brought him in for questioning. During questioning, Yancey provided information about the sadistic, masochistic behavior he had witnessed, including in David's trailer, and described photographs he had seen of David's ex-wife in a restraining position, as well as seeing David torturing a girl in the trailer, but insisting that the girl had consented to being tortured. During the second questioning, Yancey changed his story. He said that he knew the murdered Marie, who was in fact his ex-girlfriend. On the 5th of July 1997, he went to a bar with David and Glenda. At first he thought they were going to do a drug deal, but the father and daughter went in and took Marie out, where they handcuffed her and warned her that they would kill her if she talked. Yancey, in turn, sat in the back of the car with Marie and was responsible for calming her. They then took Marie to the trailer. During this process, Yancey considered calling the police, but he was afraid that David would kill him, and he knew that Marie had been held for 3 days and repeatedly tortured. On the 4th day, David and Glenda came to Yancey and told him that they were finished with her. They gave Yancey a rope and instructed him to strangle her, which he did, and then together they dumped the body in a remote location. After it was over, David threatened him with the same fate if he revealed what had happened. He tried to tell the police where Marie's body was, but he was unable to find the exact location, and it is possible that David moved the body because he feared Yancey would snitch. On the 10th of April 1999, Yancey was arrested on suspicion of murder and also charged with kidnapping, tampering with evidence, and conspiracy. And his case ended with 2 15-year sentences for 2 counts of second-degree murder and 1 count of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. Cindy's charges were reduced from 25 to 5 counts of conspiracy and accessory after she provided detailed information to help in these cases, and she was sentenced to 36 years in prison to be released in 2019. After seeing the ongoing news coverage, an elderly woman reported a bizarre incident to the police. Her son's ex-wife, Kelly Garrett, had inexplicably disappeared for 3 days. When she appeared in public, she was ragged and mentally ill, often incoherent. They assumed that Kelly was in hiding and using drugs, causing the problems, so they let her go. But it wasn't until she read the reports that she thought Kelly might be suffering not from drug addiction, but from David's torture. Eventually, the police found Kelly, who was identified as the woman who had been tortured and beaten on the video, but she had only fragmentary memories of what had happened. And those memories included being taken to the trailer by Glenda, David threatening her with a knife while Glenda took control of her, and then being stripped naked and tied to a bench in a small room. And she remembered exactly what was in the trailer, and she remembered being subjected to several types of sexual assault. After a few days of torture, probably due to her mental breakdown, David thought that such a person would not be a problem for him, so he let her go. On the 26th of April, Glenda was arrested and charged with abducting women for the purpose of sexual torture, and David's charges were increased to 37 counts. At her trial, her lawyer stated that Glenda strongly and categorically denied any criminal connection with her father and predicted that more arrests would be made before the end of the case, which ended with a 9-year prison sentence. A judge ruled that the criminal cases against Cynthia, Angelica, and Kelly would be separated, meaning that David would be tried separately. And the judge also ruled that most of the evidence found in the trailer during the 1999 raid would not be admissible in Kelly or Angelica's case, including David's tape recordings, even though he had detailed his kidnapping and torture habits. The first trial was for Kelly's crimes, and David was charged with 12 counts of sexual abuse, kidnapping, and conspiracy. Kelly took the stand to testify about what David had done to her, but her memory was fragmented and did not convey well that she had been forced to do these things. Although it was possible that she had been drugged, this could not be proved. The judge then declared a mistrial, and despite deliberating for over 8 hours, the jury claimed that they couldn't agree on the 12 charges. 2 of them felt that David was not guilty of assault. They felt that the victim had failed to convince them. One of them said, "I'm not sure he tortured her. After all, there are lots of people who like rough sex." When Kelly heard the news, she was in tears. She didn't know why they didn't believe her, or how she could convince people that she didn't have such evil thoughts or want to be subjected to such torture. Perhaps realizing that he would never get away with his crimes, David remembered the daughter, Glenda, and in an effort to gain leniency for her, he agreed to a plea bargain, and then Glenda received 5 years probation, because in David's mind, freedom was the last gift he could give her. In the end, in 2001, he was sentenced to 224 years in prison for kidnapping and sexually assaulting 3 young women. But things quickly took a turn for the worse, and he soon appealed his sentence, saying that his guilty plea was not voluntary and that it was ill health, medication, and pressure from his legal advisors that led him to plead guilty. But a 3-judge panel rejected the appeal, saying that David had been taking his normal dose of medication at the time of the agreement, that he had not complained about pressure from his lawyer, and that no expert had testified that the medication confused him. The agreement was therefore upheld. On the 28th of May 2002, just as David was about to be transferred to the general prison population at the Lee County Correctional Facility in Hobbs, New Mexico, he died of heart attack. The following are several murders suspected to have been committed by David, most of which were reported to the police by Cindy, but could not be convicted until there was too much evidence or the victim's remains were found. In 1986, at the age of 51, Billy Ray Bowers became co-owner of Canal Motors, a used car dealership on North Van Buren Street in Phoenix, Arizona, a business that employed David, although he often clashed with Billy. On the 25th of September 1988, Billy mysteriously disappeared in Phoenix, Arizona. A year later, a fisherman found the body of an unidentified man wrapped in a blue tarp in McRae Cove on Elephant Butte Lake, with no information to identify him, and an autopsy report indicated the cause of death was a gunshot wound to the back of the head. It wasn't until March 1999 that police finally identified him as Billy by comparing dental records. Jill Suzanne Troya, 22-year-old, was last seen late on the 30th of September 1995 at the Frontier Restaurant in the 2400 block of East Central in Albuquerque, New Mexico. That night, she went to a bar with a friend and then went to the restaurant with Glenda. According to witnesses, Glenda and Troya got into an argument inside the restaurant, and Glenda later told police that she left Troya at the restaurant before driving with David to Elephant Butte Reservoir in southern New Mexico, but Troya disappeared from there. It wasn't until David wrote detailed descriptions of sexual torture and murder victims in prison that police discovered that one of them was an Asian victim who matched Troya's facial features. The police also found among the victim's belongings a letter dated June 1990 from an Australian man called Mark to a young woman called Connie, who David's diary described as an 18-year-old white woman with long blonde hair, a birthmark on her chest, and a height of 160 centimeters, who he had abducted and murdered in December 1995. At the time, the Australian Federal Police and the Federal Bureau of Investigation investigated in the hope of finding Mark so that he could identify Connie, but they did not, perhaps because there was too little information, or it is possible that Mark was also murdered. To this day, Connie has not been found, and there is no information about her in the existing cases of unidentified or missing persons. On the 30th of June 1999 at 10:30 a.m., 61-year-old Ralph Tudor was fishing when he caught an 80-pound sack containing a pile of meat. He originally thought it was all some animal meat, but after opening the sack, the more he thought about it, the more wrong it became. Because if it was animal meat, then why would they put it in a sack and throw it into a lake? So he called the police to report that he had found a sack suspected to contain human flesh. After a police investigation, Tudor's suspicions were confirmed, and a DNA test showed that it belonged to a female victim who had not been reported missing, although the police wanted to identify her. The FBI released hundreds of images of items collected during the investigation in 2011, some of which they thought might belong to the victim, including jewelry and clothing. And to this day, the police haven't given up, and if you search the internet for information about David, you can still see images of items that might belong to the victim. In the history of the United States, there was a woman named Louise Preslar Peete who won the hearts of most men with her gentle appearance and elegant demeanor. But in reality, she hid a cold, ugly soul, and the men who approached her died inexplicably, such as by poisoning or shooting themselves. It wasn't until 1920 that a private detective searched her house and uncovered her crimes. It was then that she was revealed to be an extremely cold-blooded killer, robber, swindler, and sociopath. Her charm and lies are her deadliest weapons, and she smiles as she approaches the men who are attracted to her, oblivious to the fact that they are walking step by step to death. Like Latrodectus mactans, the species of spider that eats its mate after mating, she plans each hunt in the shadows, ostensibly for money, but her true motive for murder becomes difficult to decipher after her execution in a California gas chamber. On an unusual Tuesday, September 20th, 1880, Louise was born in Bienville Parish, Louisiana, a place where history and nature intertwine, known for its rich cultural and natural landscapes of beautiful forests and abundant wildlife. Her father was Thomas Jefferson Preslar, who, according to census records, was a schoolteacher, and in addition to that capacity, he was in the printing business, which was very lucrative at the time. And he was able to send his children to private schools, indicating that his financial status was middle class or above at the time. Their mother was Elizabeth Miria Foster, and although not much is known about her, she was also a very fine woman, based on her husband. Thomas, a former teacher, knew the importance of learning, and took an elite approach to raising his children, choosing to send them to a private school in New Orleans for their education. When Louise was about 15 years old, she was expelled from school for stealing her classmates' belongings and engaging in inappropriate sexual behavior. There were two possibilities for her to have made these mistakes. The first possibility was because she had originally lived a very comfortable life in her hometown where she had used money to develop complacency. But upon arriving at the private school in the city of New Orleans, she realized that there were many people who were better off and richer than she was. And so she was blinded by the blindness of money and class. The second possibility is that she found theft and inappropriate sexual behavior very interesting, and she indulged in these very exciting behaviors. In 1903, at the age of 23, Louise married Henry Bosley, a traveling salesman, and 4 years later Henry decided to commit suicide after discovering that Louise was having an inappropriate relationship with an oil worker in New Orleans. I find this act of suicide strange. Louisiana law at that time emphasized the sanctity of marriage, and the divorce laws were quite strict. The grounds for divorce included adultery, desertion, cruelty, and sexual impotence. It just so happened that Louise fit into one of these categories. And if she had gotten a divorce, she would have suffered a lot of scorn in the community. So there's a possibility that this was a way for her not to be subjected to that treatment, and she chose to murder Henry so that she still had access to the upper class and the fact that no one thought she was a bad woman. Another possibility is that she took out an insurance policy for Henry. She was aware that Henry was a devoted man in love and marriage. She understood that he would kill himself if he saw her in bed with another man, which would explain why she liked money so much. Louise then moved to Shreveport and worked as a sex worker for high society clients, stealing property from her clients, knowing full well that these people would not report these thefts to the police for their own glory. In 1911, Louise traveled to Boston, Massachusetts, and changed her name to Louise M. Gould. She created the lie that she was from Dallas, an heiress named Rosley, and that she had escaped from a convent after the family tried to get their hands on her inheritance and put her in a convent. Using this harrowing story and her charm, Louise was able to gain the trust of several wealthy families and convince one to take her in. She then continued to deceive these people by using their money to continue shopping in these expensive stores and stealing money from their friends and employees, saying that she would give them more money when she succeeded in getting her inheritance so that these people wouldn't feel cheated. But the police later found out Louise's real identity, and in order to avoid any embarrassment to these people, she was quietly driven out of Boston. Louise later moved to Waco, Texas, and formed a relationship with a wealthy local oil tycoon, Joe Appel. But just a week after they met, Joe was shot and killed in his home. And at the same time, his precious diamond jewelry disappeared, for which Louise was charged with murder. But during the trial, she claimed that it was Joe's attempted rape of her that made her shoot and kill him. And then an all-male jury acquitted her in a bizarre trial in which no one noticed the missing jewelry. In 1913, Louise traveled to Dallas and quickly married Harry Fourot, who worked as a night clerk at the local St. George Hotel. Soon after, Louise was suspected of stealing $20,000 worth of jewelry from the hotel safe, and the police questioned Fourot because he was the only one who had the time to commit the burglary. But instead of linking him to the burglary, they questioned Louise, whom they suspected of being involved in the burglary, but had no hard evidence to link her directly to the crime. Fourot, on the other hand, was extremely embarrassed by the accusation that he was involved in the burglary. He also found his wife in bed with another man. He finally decided to shoot himself, but he ended up in almost the same place as Henry. In 1915, Louise moved to Denver, Colorado, and married Richard Peete, a salesman who worked there. Their marriage produced a daughter, Frances Ann, who was born in 1916. However, the marriage was not a harmonious one, with frequent arguments between the two, and they finally decided to separate in the summer of 1920. For a fresh start, Louise moves to Los Angeles, where she meets Jacob C. Denton, a recently widowed mining engineer who had amassed a multi-million-dollar fortune before retiring with a teenage daughter. Denton was looking for a tenant and was renting his 14-room mansion at 675 South Catalina Street, near Wilshire Boulevard, for $350 a month. And for some unknown reason, he agreed to rent the mansion for $75 a month to Louise, who moved in on May 26th, just a few days before Denton was scheduled to leave. The nature of her relationship with him is unclear. She was considered his live-in girlfriend, housekeeper, and tenant, and she never formally signed the lease. Louise later claimed that a romantic relationship existed between them. On June 2nd, 1920, just over a week after Louise moved into the mansion, he mysteriously disappeared. Shortly thereafter, she hired a gardener to bring a load of soil to the basement, claiming she was going to grow mushrooms. And on June 5th, she forged Denton's signature, withdrew $300 from his bank account, and opened his safe deposit box. When a bank employee expressed skepticism about his signature, she explained that Denton's right arm had been amputated after an altercation with an angry, mysterious Spanish woman, and that he now signed only with his left hand. She claimed that the anomaly in the signature was due to the fact that she had to help him write the check and sign his name with his left hand, and she later offered several different versions of the story, including one in which the woman had cut off his arm and leg with a sword and said that him had gone into seclusion out of shame over his amputated arm and would only see and speak to her. Over the next few weeks, as his friends, business associates, and neighbors begin to question Louise about his whereabouts, she weaves several stories to explain his disappearance. One of which is that Denton is on an extended business trip to another location and will be back soon. In the meantime, Louise began posing as his wife, squandering his money, driving his Cadillac, pawning his jewelry and possessions, and renting out rooms in his mansion, keeping the rent for herself. Louise also persuaded tenants at his Phoenix, Arizona property to pay her rent, and in August she charged 2 expensive dresses at Brock's department store in Denton's wife's name. Around this time, his daughter hired a lawyer to try to locate her father. The attorney interviewed Louise, but she said she did not know where Denton was, although she agreed to return Denton's financial and business records as soon as possible. Over the next month, she rented out the mansion and returned to her estranged husband and daughter in Denver. With Louise gone, Denton's daughter was finally able to search the premises. On September 23rd, the attorney hired a private investigator to search the house, and he found his decomposing body buried in a wooden compartment under the basement stairs. An autopsy determined that he had been shot in the head and strangled. The police then tracked down Louise and questioned her about his murder. She says that the unidentified and mysterious Spanish woman who shot him and caused his arm to be amputated was the murderer. But this theory is quickly dismissed when his body is found with his right arm still intact, and Louise then claims that the body was not his. Rather, it was the body of a double he had killed. She was returned to Los Angeles and charged with first-degree murder, and her trial began on January 21, 1921. Louise's trial became the focus of the nation's newspapers, especially the Hearst newspaper system, known for its sensationalism and yellow journalism, which covered it extensively. Thousands of spectators lined up each day just to see Louise enter the courtroom. On February 17th, she was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. She was first sent to San Quentin State Prison and later to the California Institution for Women in Tehachapi. While in prison, she was a model inmate, working as a dental assistant, tending the prison garden, and writing for the prison newspaper. Louise's husband, Richard, stood steadfastly by her during the trial and the first 2 years of her sentence, convinced of her innocence. In 1923, Louise persuaded Richard to divorce her so that he would be free to remarry. He agreed, but promised to wait forever for her release. Soon after the divorce, however, Louise stopped answering his letters and refused to see him, and Richard despaired of her indifference and finally committed suicide in an Arizona hotel room in 1924. After serving 18 years, Louise was paroled for good behavior in 1939. Upon her release, she was taken in by Jesse Marcy, who had fought for her release, and began working as her housekeeper. Shortly thereafter, Marcy died of natural causes, and Louise moved into the home of her parole officer, Emily Latham, to work as a nurse and housekeeper before Latham finally died of a heart attack in 1943. Neither of these deaths was investigated in detail, as the police were unaware at the time that Louise had been the subject of a previously publicized murder and was on parole. Louise then moved into the home of Arthur C. Logan, she and his wife Margaret, an elderly couple living in Pacific Palisades. While in prison, she had struck up a friendship with Margaret, a retired social worker who believed in Louise's innocence and fought for her release. They even took care of Louise's daughter during her incarceration. Louise worked for Mr. and Mrs. Logan as a housekeeper and nurse for Arthur, who suffered from age-related dementia and was declared mentally incompetent. She later married Lee Borden Judson, a banker, on May 2, 1944, but she did not disclose to her husband her history of imprisonment for murder. Shortly after Louise began working for the Logan family, she began disclosing to neighbors that Arthur had been physically assaulting her and Margaret on a regular basis. 20 days later, Margaret disappeared, and 3 days after that, Louise took Arthur to Barton State Hospital, claiming to be his foster sister. Louise said that Arthur had attacked his wife in a rage, biting her nose so badly that it was disfigured. When Judson begins to inquire about Margaret's whereabouts, she again states that it was Arthur who attacked his wife, adding that Margaret has gone into hiding to undergo plastic surgery. For the next 6 months, Louise and Judson continued to live at the Logan home, and, as she had with Denton, she began squandering the Logans' money and forging their names on checks. On December 6, 1944, Arthur died at Barton State Hospital. After his death, employees of the Logan Bank discovered a forged check written by Louise and called the police. While investigating the forgery, the police searched the Logan home where Louise and her husband were still living. On December 20th, 1944, 6 months after Margaret's disappearance, police found her decomposing body in a shallow grave under an avocado tree in their backyard. Louise was arrested and charged with murder within hours of the discovery. At trial, Louise claimed that Margaret had been beaten and shot with a blunt object by Arthur, and she admitted burying Margaret, but denied killing her. She said she did not report the murder because she feared she would be blamed for her previous conviction, and an autopsy determined that Margaret had been shot in the back of the neck and had a fractured skull. Judson was also arrested and charged with murder, and both couples maintained their innocence. On January 11, 1945, Judson's murder charge was dropped due to insufficient evidence, and he was released. The next day, he jumped to his death from the 9th floor of the Spring Arcade, an office building in Los Angeles. Upon learning of her husband's death, Louise wept and told a reporter, "It's all my fault. He can't face the shame, but as long as he's associated with me, he'll be famous." Louise's trial opened in Los Angeles on April 23, 1945, with prosecutors suggesting that Louise's motive for killing Margaret was to gain control of her finances. They stated that Louise killed Margaret after the two had an argument over a $200 check that Louise had forged in Arthur's name, and on May 31st, a jury found Louise guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced her to death. As the verdict was announced, Louise was found in the courtroom reading Lin Yutang's book on Chinese philosophy, The Importance of Living. She glanced up briefly, gave the prosecutor a mocking look, and then returned to her reading. After her conviction, she continued to protest her innocence, and after several unsuccessful appeals, she was finally executed in the gas chamber of San Quentin State Prison on April 11, 1947. John Edward Robinson, from Cicero, Illinois, USA, is a serial killer who is still alive and well. He's also known as the first serial killer on the internet. Since internet chat rooms let people from different places chat, meet, and date, he was the only one who used the internet's virtual nature to lure innocent people into his carefully laid death traps. His crimes were shocking because, as far as anyone could remember, he had a wife and children, lived an ordinary suburban life, and his gentle demeanor, always with a smile on his face, and willingness to chat like a friendly neighbor made it almost impossible for anyone to be wary of him. But the fraud, embezzlement, entrapment, kidnapping, sexual abuse, murders, and even hiding his victims in chemical barrels on his farm were the real him. It's only through his life story that we can really understand why he ended up committing crimes. John was born in Cicero, Illinois, on December 18, 1943. It was a pretty chaotic time there, and the area had a reputation for being a haven for criminals, as well as violent and racist elements. In the 1920s, Chicago gang leader Al Capone set up his headquarters in Cicero. In 1951, an African-American family tried to move into the area and were subjected to violence that sparked riots, and the family was eventually forced to leave. John's father was an alcoholic, and his mother kept a close eye on him. There are very few accounts of this, but it's easy to imagine the abuse he may have suffered when his father was drunk and his mother kept tabs on him, restricting his freedom and privacy. In 1957, John became a Boy Scout and was lucky enough to travel with a group of scouts who performed in front of Queen Elizabeth II in London, and he even got a kiss from actress and singer Judy Garland. A year later, he entered Quigley Preparatory Seminary, a private school for boys who want to become priests. Away from his controlling parents, he misbehaved a lot, did poorly in school, and often got into fights with his classmates, and also spent more time in the school's detention room than he did studying. So he was expelled after less than a year. 2 years later, at the nagging and advice of his parents, John enrolled at Morton Junior College in Cicero to study X-ray technology, the one program that was pretty much his future in crime. He studied at this school for 2 years, but was expelled for violating school rules and failed to get his license. John's murders didn't happen overnight. He spent his younger years honing his craft, perfecting his fraudulent skills. In 1964, he relocated to Kansas City, where he secured a position as an X-ray technician by presenting a forged credential. That same year, at the age of 21, he married a woman named Nancy Jo Lynch, and they had 4 children within 7 years. In 1966, he was fired from his job because he was lazy and incompetent, but he quickly found another position at a different medical clinic. In this job, he even had sex with staff and patients. In 1969, he was arrested for embezzling $33,000 from the clinic and sentenced to 3 years in prison and 3 years of probation. During the second year of his probation, he broke the rules by moving from Kansas City, where he was serving his sentence, to Chicago without permission. He then found a position as an insurance salesman with R.B. Jones. But, once again, he was arrested for embezzling company funds, then returned to Kansas City and extended his probation. In 1975, he set up a fake medical consulting firm in Kansas City, which led to his sentence being extended for securities fraud and mail fraud. In 1977, he took a job with a disability services organization and managed to get on the board of directors. And immediately after, he forged a series of letters from leaders of charitable organizations and even the mayor of Kansas City complimenting him on his dedication to volunteerism, and then disguised himself as the organization's Person of the Year and hosted a meal to celebrate the honor. With this disguise, he completed his probation in 1979. But by 1980, he was again arrested on multiple charges, including embezzlement and check forgery, among others, and thus served 60 days in prison. His first step after being released from prison was to set up a bogus hydroponics company and then scammed out of $25,000 from a friend who had hoped for a quick return on his investment to pay for his life-threatening wife's medical bills. But, alas, he was scammed. Boy Scout leader, Sunday school teacher, and sports team coach, 3 occupations that could not be timed with certainty except to confirm that he held them during his time in Kansas City. Perhaps during the 1980s, so as to fill in the gaps in John's life between 1980 and 1984, and perhaps he had been doing all of these jobs prior to his arrest. John has admitted to killing 8 people, but there may have been many more victims just waiting to be discovered. In 1984, he set up 2 fake companies, Equi Plus and Equi 2, and hired 19-year-old Paula Godfrey as a sales rep through an ad. At the time, she told her family and friends that John wanted her to go to Texas with a group of women for clerical skills training. On September 1st, John picked her up at her house in Overland Park, Kansas, and drove her to the airport for her flight. After that, she disappeared and never contacted her family again. Paula's father, sensing that something was wrong, confronted John, but he denied everything, so they filed a missing person report with the police. A few days later, Paula's parents got a letter from their daughter saying she was doing well and not to worry, with her own signature at the bottom. Since Paula was of legal age and there was no evidence of any wrongdoing, the police stopped investigating her disappearance. 3 months after Paula disappeared, just before Christmas 1984, John visited several shelters and hospitals in Kansas City to talk to social workers about a new program he was putting together. One social worker said in an interview that John told her the program was for women who had been bullied and oppressed, especially young mothers who were pregnant or had recently given birth. Its goal was to help them get back on their feet and find a stable place to live. After Christmas, the social worker got another call from John. He said he'd found a girl who was willing to take part in the program. Her name was Lisa Stassi, 19 years old, and also had a 4-month-old daughter. John told Lisa he'd get her a job in Chicago, find her an apartment, and take care of the child's daycare, among other things. Then he picked them up from a place Lisa had borrowed and checked them into a hotel that had been booked on January 10, 1985, for the night. Betty Stacy, Lisa's mother-in-law, said she got a call from Lisa who was in tears. She said she had to sign 4 pieces of paper and Betty told her not to sign anything. During the call, Lisa calmed down and said, "They're coming," and then she hung up. That was the last time Betty spoke to her, and after that, Lisa disappeared. The police investigator said that Lisa's family had received a letter from her printed on a typewriter. The former administrator of the women's shelter also read a letter written to her by Lisa on January 10, 1985, in an ABC News interview. It said, "I want to thank you for all of your help. I have decided to leave this place and try to make a good life for me and my daughter." However, Lisa's mother said she couldn't spell a complete letter, let alone use a typewriter. A few days later, John called people who knew Lisa, saying that Lisa and her daughter had disappeared from the hotel and asking if they heard anything about Lisa. Lisa's daughter, Tiffany, wasn't dead, after all. After John was arrested for murder in 2000, the police started looking for the missing victims, which included Lisa's kids. The end result was pretty shocking. Lisa's daughter was a 15-year-old girl named Heather Robinson, who was raised by John's own brother's family. On January 10, 1985, John contacted his brother and sister-in-law. They had been unable to adopt a baby through the usual channels for many years. John told them that a young mother he knew had committed suicide, leaving a baby behind. He also told them to pay a $5,500 processing fee to an attorney's agency to proceed with the adoption as quickly as possible. The next day, on January 11th, John met with them with the baby and some fake adoption papers. After they swapped the babies, there was an Uncle John in Tiffany's life from then on. In an interview with ABC News in 2019, Tiffany said that she had a negative relationship with her uncle growing up. When she was a teenager, she found out that she was adopted and asked her adoptive parents about her birth mother. They didn't know anything about it and could only tell her about her adoption, so she had to turn to John. John invited Tiffany to his farm in Kansas City, telling her that she would know everything when she came. That was where it all started. Tiffany didn't show up because she was scared. When the reporter asked, "What do you think would have happened if you had shown up?" she replied, "I think I would have been killed and put in a barrel." Before the interview, Tiffany had visited the farm where John had placed the gasoline drum containing the body, accompanied by the police and the reporter. Her mother, Lisa's body, was not found there, but she still felt infinite darkness and fear as she walked the land. In January 1987, Catherine Frances Clampett, who was 27 at the time, left her kids with her parents, moved to Kansas City to live with her brother and his family. Not long after that, she saw an ad for Equi 2, a management consulting firm that promised lots of travel and a brand new closet. John hired her, and on June 15, 1987, she left to meet him, and she hasn't been seen since, and the case of her disappearance is still pending. Between 1987 and 1993, John was convicted and jailed in Kansas for multiple fraud offenses and was later imprisoned again in Missouri for another fraud conviction and a parole violation. While he was serving his sentence at the West Missouri Correctional Facility, he met Beverly Bonner, a 49-year-old prison librarian. When he got out in January 1994, Bonner left her husband, who was a prison doctor, and moved to Kansas to work for John. After John set up a poo box in Kansas for her alimony check, her family never heard from her again. For years, Bonner's mother sent out her alimony checks, which were always cashed by John. Sheila Faith, a 45-year-old single mother, was devastated by the death of her husband and found it tough to raise her disabled 15-year-old daughter, Debbie Faith, on her own. She often turns to the internet as a way of finding relief from the pressure she's under. Once, she was drawn in by a man she met on a bad website. He painted a wonderful picture for her. "I'm a wealthy businessman. I'll take care of you and you can be my slave for the rest of your life. We'll travel all the time, go to exotic places, and live a wonderful life." Then Sheila fell so deeply in love with this man that she told her friends she and her daughter would move into his home in Kansas. Her friends were surprised by this sudden decision and warned her it was too risky, but she did not listen. In the summer of 1994, a man came to help her move, and after that, they were never seen again. In fact, shortly after Sheila left for Kansas, her brother received a letter from Sheila saying how happy she was. He was always suspicious, though, and asked Social Security to track his sister and niece through Debbie's disability Social Security checks, but the administrator wouldn't give him that information. In the fall of 1994, Social Security got a letter from Dr. William Bonner. He told them that Debbie was now totally disabled and needed to be cared for around the clock. He also said that her check would need to be increased, but none of the staff members involved thought anything was out of the ordinary. At the time in Kansas City, it was John who was claiming the guarantee in Sheila's name, but the mother and daughter were actually dead. Over time, John became more careless and sloppy, and in 1999, 2 more missing persons with ties to him were finally flagged by police in Kansas and Missouri. One of them, Isabella Lewicka, was born in Poland and moved with her family to the United States at the age of 15, and she started a strange lifestyle at the age of 19. In 1997, like Sheila, she connected with John through a website looking for a sex partner, and she moved from Indiana to Kansas City, less than 9 months after she met John. She was already married, but he gave her an engagement ring and took her to the county registrar's office to get a marriage license, but this certificate was never picked up. Isabella also signed a slavery contract with 115 clauses. In 1999, she suddenly disappeared, and John told a web designer he had hired that Isabella had been arrested for marijuana use and deported. Later, Isabella's parents received a letter from her with her handwriting on it. After the arrest, John said he'd tell the innocent victims he was taking them on a trip around the world on his yacht. He said it would get hectic once the trip started, so they'd need to sign some blank paper before it started. And these signatures served the purpose of being sent by John to the victims' families after their deaths to minimize their suspicions. But the ruse didn't work on the victim, Suzette Troughton. It was her family that tipped off the authorities and led to John's arrest. In 1999, Suzette met a man named Junior in an online chat room who said he was a wealthy businessman from Kansas City. That man was John. After a few months of emailing back and forth, John made Suzette an offer to care for his diabetic father while he traveled around the world. She was tempted by the offer, but decided to meet with John and his father before making a decision, just to be on the safe side. She met with John in October, and he had some people act as members of his family to get her to relax. After 5 days, she accepted the job and officially moved there on February 14, 2000 to prepare for her new life. For the next 2 weeks, she rented an apartment using John's credit card, and then he would visit regularly and take pictures of the two of them. Suzette would then send these photos to her friend Crystal, but as of March 1st, the content of her emails changed a lot. Instead of talking about their friendship or the small details of her life, she would give exaggerated accounts of how great her life was and how happy her hosts made her. Crystal thinks the person who sent the email isn't her best friend when Suzette offers to introduce Crystal to a host so she can live the same happy life as Suzette. Crystal accepts the offer without moving and is soon contacted by a man claiming to be a strict but honorable host. She noticed that this man's emails were very similar to Suzette's, so she figured it was probably the same person. After chatting with this guy for a few weeks, Crystal gets a call from him. Then a new contact, Tom, shows up. He emails her and says he'd also like to be her host, and gives her a phone number where she can be reached at any time. Crystal then asked a police friend to trace the three men's calls, and each number eventually led to John. So she called the police, who in turn asked her to continue to follow up on the emails as usual, and monitored their email exchanges. By the end of March, John had called Suzette's mother. He told her that her daughter had turned down his job offer and had gone off with someone else to travel the world. During the call, Suzette's mother asked John if she should tell anyone about her daughter's disappearance. John said, "Honey, I really wouldn't worry too much about it. I'm sure they'll send us a card, phone call, email, or something when they get to their next destination." But she'd already decided that John was lying after that phone call. Then Suzette's sister contacted the police and asked them to find her sister's 2 dogs. She said Suzette would never go anywhere, much less travel, without the 2 dogs. In the end, after a police search, they found the 2 dogs in a trawler park where John had lived. They'd been abandoned on the same day that Suzette disappeared. While looking for Suzette, the officers found out that she and John had stayed at a hotel in February. The medical examiner found blood in their room, but couldn't figure out where it came from. John, who was under police surveillance, checked into room 120 of the Extended Stay America Hotel on April 23rd with an anonymous woman from Dallas. 5 days later, John told the woman to go back to Dallas and pack for a move to Kansas, which he had promised to help her with, but he didn't show up at the agreed-upon time. So the woman was unable to reach him, and because John had taken a number of intimate photographs of the woman and she wanted them back, she told the agents who came to question her about the incident. On May 19, 2000, John was again accused by an anonymous woman. She told the police that John had repeatedly beaten her and forced her to take the photographs. Thankfully, John left when she began to resist. But Suzette was not so lucky. During the trial, the jury was shown a video. The video showed John in a hotel room with Suzette. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, looking into the camera lens. She told John, "This is what you want me to tell you. I'm your slave. Everything I am is yours." And then, for 40 minutes, the video showed John sexually abusing her. At the end of the video, John told her that the most important thing in life is that she is his slave. Ultimately, she was killed by John in the same way as the other 4 women whose bodies were found, with 1 or 2 blows to the head. In late January 2001, Missouri State's Attorney Chris Koster charged John with 56 counts of forgery, including Sheila's and Debbie's social security checks. If only count the forgery counts, he was also facing 382 years of incarceration. On September 16, 2002, John was tried in court for the murders of Isabella, Lisa, and Suzette. The police had a lot of evidence against John, including more than 23,000 ciphers and over 100 witnesses. They also found about 18 hammers in his personal belongings. These were sent to a lab for examination, but the technicians couldn't determine which of the hammers were the murder weapon. John's wife also testified that she knew her husband had had sex with other women using aliases, and admitted that he thoroughly enjoyed his perverted lifestyle. The defense team filed an appeal at the last minute, saying that the prosecution's evidence was slow to be released, but it didn't help. On October 29, 2002, the jury reached a guilty verdict in less than a day, and in January 2003, John was sentenced to death. The death penalty in Missouri is much harsher than in Kansas. The Missouri prosecutor insisted that John had to lead the police to Lisa, Paula, and Catherine as part of the plea bargain. However, this would have constituted a guilty plea, which could then have been used against him in Kansas. Therefore, John refused. It became clear that if John didn't cooperate, the 3 women who were brutally murdered would never be found. In the end, in October 2003, in a carefully written plea, John admitted that the prosecution had enough evidence to warrant a death sentence. So he agreed to the plea without providing any information. His statement was technically an admission of guilt, but it was clear that he didn't show any remorse or accept responsibility. In November 2015, the Kansas Supreme Court overturned the convictions of Suzette and Lisa for murder due to a technicality, but upheld John's conviction and death sentence for Isabella. This means that it was only a matter of time before John would have been executed anyway, and he remains on death row at the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas, awaiting his execution. In Belanglo State Forest, Australia, there's a pretty chilling account of the exploits of a serial killer named Ivan Robert Marko Milat. At the time, he became known as a person to be feared even in New South Wales, where he was called backpacker murderer, because he specialized in targeting backpackers who wanted to explore or travel. He knows that towns and cities in Australia are far apart, so hitchhiking is a great option for backpackers on a budget. He usually disguises himself as a friendly driver and offers hitchhiking to backpackers. When they accept his advances, he drives to a remote area, then shows his ugly face, pulls out a pistol or knife, and kidnaps them. For those couples who were unlucky enough to cross paths with him, his behavior was even more heinous. He would sexually assault the women in front of the male victim, and then end their lives with extreme violence, such as slashing, shooting, strangling, beating, and beheading. His crimes not only resulted in the deaths of 7 innocent people, but also had a significant impact on Australia's backpacker culture. In the 1920s, a lot of Croatians left their homeland because of the economy. St. Jepan Marko Milat was one of them. He was young at the time. Then he gave himself the English name Stephen and wanted to move to Australia, which was looking for a lot of workers to help with construction and industry after the war. He was accepted as a European immigrant under the White Australia policy, which was based on racial discrimination. He then worked on a wharf in Sydney. Around 1938, at the age of 36, he met 18-year-old Margaret Elizabeth Piddleston. They dated for a while and then got married. They initially lived on a makeshift farm in Bosley Park, 36 kilometers west of Sydney. They lived in poverty, but they had 14 children together during their lifetime. On an ordinary Wednesday, December 27, 1944, at the Crown Street Women's Hospital in New South Wales, they welcomed the birth of their 5th child, Milat, who would go on to commit serial murders more than 40 years later. Stephen works on the docks, working 10 hours a day for a meager salary to support his family, and the work on the docks is so tiring that he can't get off work until late at night. So he drinks a lot, wanting to rely on alcohol to anesthetize his brain and forget about the troubles of life. But the dangers of alcohol are so serious that he often beats his wife and children when he is drunk. His wife Piddleston was also quick-tempered, but she only took it out on her kids. Her son Boris said in an interview that his mother was beaten by Stephen at least once a week. Once, after being beaten, his mother got angry and hit him once with a knife. He doesn't remember why he was hit, but the scars are still visible today. Later on, Piddleston started a tomato plantation to make some extra money. The kids also worked on the plantation to help pay for school. It's worth noting that, despite their poverty and difficult relationship, Stephen and Piddleston valued education, and they sent all of their children to Catholic schools. The violence and poverty really affected the family a lot, but the biggest problem was the children's psychoeducation. There were 10 boys out of 14 children, and most of them had attracted the attention of the local police because of their habitual use of knives and guns, as well as their frequent target shooting in the yard in the afternoons. It's possible that Milat was born with a criminal inclination, but it's also possible that it was the influence of his family. His older brother Boris, the only one in the family who spoke out against Milat, has commented on him. He said that Milat displayed antisocial and psychotic behaviors from an early age. For example, he cut a dog in half with a machete when he was a child, which led to him being sent to a boarding school. At 17, he was sent to a juvenile detention center for burglary. One report said that Milat, at 17, told Boris he'd accidentally shot a cab driver during a gun operation. The driver was paralyzed from the waist down, but Milat wasn't even arrested. An innocent man was convicted and served 5 years. As he got older, Milat's offenses became more serious, and he spent more time in prison. At 19, he was also involved in a store robbery. A year later, he was arrested and sentenced to 18 months for breaking into a house. Even after going to prison, his behavior didn't improve. A month after his release, he was arrested for stealing a vehicle and sentenced to 2 years. After his release, he was sentenced to 3 years for burglary. It's possible that some criminals make behavioral and psychological improvements and corrections after spending time in prison. However, for Milat, crime was just a part of his repertoire. On April 7, 1971, he abducted 2 young female hitchhikers, both 18 years old, at knife point near the Liverpool train station. He then drove outside of the city limits, waiting until he got to a place where there were fewer people around. There, he raped one of his victims. Fortunately, though, the women managed to break free and escape when Milat stopped at a gas station to buy a coffee. It seems Milat was too lazy to escape his pursuers. He was arrested by the police later that night and charged with rape and armed robbery. While he was waiting for his trial, he got involved in a series of robberies with some of his brothers. Then he left his shoes at the Gap, which is Sydney's famous suicide place, and pretended to take his own life. At this point, Milat was thought to be dead, but in 1974 he was arrested by police at the hospital after his mother was rushed there with a heart attack. The police think that at that time, Milat fled to Queensland and Victoria, then flew to New Zealand, where he lived for 2 years before the New Zealand police suspected him of using a false passport, so he's sneaking back to Australia. Since he was caught, the trial continued in 1971. However, with the help of a family lawyer, John Marsden, the charges against him for robbery, kidnapping, and rape were dropped due to insufficient evidence presented by the prosecutor. In 1975, he got a job as a truck driver for the Roads and Traffic Authority of New South Wales. This job helped him plan his murders because he got to know the roads around him and the places that hardly anyone would pass by while he was working. One of the most interesting things is that a government department would allow a criminal who kept committing crimes to work for them. In 1977, Milat tried to rape and murder 2 women hitchhiking from Liverpool to Canberra. Thankfully, the women escaped, but they didn't report the incident until the backpacker murders made the news. In 1983, Milat met Karen Duck, who was 16 at the time and pregnant with her cousin's child. They married in 1984 and had a daughter. However, due to domestic violence issues, Duck left him in 1987. The two were officially divorced in October 1989. Later at Milat's trial, Duck described him as a gun nut and spoke of how he had once shot a kangaroo during a visit to Belonglo State Forest. 19-year-old James Gibson and 19-year-old Deborah Everest were a young couple from Melbourne who were eager to explore and travel. On December 30th, 1989, they planned to attend a music festival in Albury. They went to Sydney first and stayed for a while in a backpackers hostel near the city centre. After checking out, they tried to hitchhike to Albury, but for some reason they just up and disappeared along the way. The next day, a bushman found Gibson's camera on the road in Galston Gorge, north of Sydney. It was the only clue to their disappearance. On October 5th, 1993, a man looking for firewood found suspected human bones in a particularly remote area of Belonglo. Then he returned to the scene with the police. They found 2 victims, identified as Gibson and Everest. Gibson's skeleton had 8 stab wounds, one of which severed his upper spine, and stab wounds in his back and chest pierced his heart and lungs. Everest had been beaten brutally, suffering fractures to his skull and jaw, and stab wounds to his forehead and back. Life has voices, especially for outgoing, adventurous Simone Loretta Schmidl, who embarks on a journey alone, falling into Milat's trap in a desolate forest far from home, and becoming one of the indomitable dead souls in his hands. She left Sydney at around 8:15 a.m. on January 20th, 1991, an unusual Sunday. The 21-year-old was from Regensburg, Bavaria, Germany, and she and her mother had a plan to go on a 6-week caravanning trip together, but until then she needed to hitchhike to Melbourne alone. Her friend Jeanette Mueller, who was staying with her, warned her never to do that alone. In fact, Simone and Mueller had originally hitchhiked around Australia and New Zealand for a few weeks, so she didn't take Mueller's warnings to heart, but just in case, she took a knife with her. Simone left the house and traveled on a bus for 15 kilometers to the Hume Highway in Liverpool, where she planned to hitchhike, and then arrive at Melbourne Airport in 4 days' time to meet her mother, who had arrived from Munich. By this time, on the Casula Highway near Liverpool, southwest of Sydney, Milat had stopped his silver 4x4, having already murdered at least 2 people, and Simone had become his next victim. Her body was found on November 1st, 1993, in the Belonglo State Forest, about 40 meters from a jungle trail known as Miner's Despair. An autopsy revealed that she had suffered multiple stab wounds, including one that severed her spine, leaving her paralyzed, before she suffered the final fatal stab wound. Gabor Neugebauer, 21-year-old, and Anja Habscheid, 20-year-old, a German couple came to Australia in 1991 to start their backpacking trip. On December 26th, they planned to hitchhike from Sydney to Adelaide and then Darwin, from where they would fly back to Munich. It was a journey of more than 4,000 kilometers. Gabor's father told the police that the last time he spoke to his son, Gabor sounded very upset and mentioned twice that he and Anja wanted to leave Australia, which was the last message they left. Gabor's father and Anja's brother traveled to Australia to look for them, but drove back and forth several times on the way without finding any clues. It wasn't until November 4th, 1993, that they were found in a remote area of Belanglo State Forest. Gabor was found with 6 bullets in his head, while Anja had been decapitated. Despite extensive searches, her skull has not yet been recovered. Joanne Walters, 22-year-old, and Carolyn Clark, 21-year-old, were backpackers from the UK who wanted to hitchhike through New South Wales and onto Victoria to pick fruit. In April 1992, they were traveling from Sydney and were passing through Belanglo State Forest in New South Wales when they met Milat. He was very well disguised. He had a kindly expression on his face and chatted very nicely with the 2 girls as they drove along. However, Milat's true colors were soon revealed as he pulled off the road onto a remote track and pulled out a handgun to threaten the 2 girls and kidnap them. On September 19, 1992, 2 joggers found a decomposed body partially hidden in the forest. The next day, the police found a second body about 30 meters away from the first. The victims were Walters and Clark. Walters had 15 stab wounds on her body, including her chest, neck, and back. The stab wounds on her back were severe enough to paralyze her, and her pants were undone. However, due to the badly decomposed body, the police were unable to determine whether she was sexually assaulted or not. In addition to multiple stab wounds on her body, Clark was shot 10 times in the head. The police believe that she may have been used by the murderer as a target for shooting practice. On October 14, 1993, the New South Wales Police formed a task force called Task Force Air, made up of more than 20 detectives and analysts. At first, they thought the crimes might have been committed by multiple killers because most of the victims appeared in pairs and were killed in different ways and buried separately. On November 5th, the New South Wales government increased the reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the perpetrator of the series of killings to 500,000 Australian dollars. A few days later, they were contacted by Paul Onions, a backpacker from the United Kingdom. He said he was traveling in Australia when he accepted an offer to hitchhike with a man who called himself Bill. The route was from Liverpool Station to Mildura, south of Mittagong, less than a kilometer from Belanglo. Bill pulled out a revolver and some rope to rob Paul, but Paul managed to escape and flagged down Joanne Berry of Canberra, who was passing by. They reported the incident to Bowler's police, including the assailant, his vehicle, and license plate number. Over the next few months, the Task Force Air used link analysis to narrow the list of suspects down from 230 to 32, including Milat. On February 26, 1994, they started keeping an eye on Milat's place on Cinnabar Street in Eagle Vale. Not long after that, the police found out that Milat had sold his silver Nissan patrol car not long after Clark and Walters were found. They also found out that Milat had been out of work for a few days after the attack. His acquaintances had told the police about his obsession with weapons before Paul came to Australia to help with the investigation. On May 5, 1994, Paul identified Milat as the man who had been hitchhiking and tried to shoot him. On May 22nd, Milat was arrested at the home on robbery and weapons charges related to the attack on Paul. Police then found a variety of weapons in his home, including one .22 caliber rifle, parts of one .22 caliber rifle matching the type used in the murder, a Browning pistol, and a Bowie knife, as well as items belonging to several of the victim, and a residence belonging to Milat's mother and his 5 brothers was also searched, and more items belonging to the victims were found. He showed up in court on May 23rd, but he didn't enter a plea. On May 31st, he was charged with 7 more backpacker murders. On June 28th, Milat fired his family's attorney James Marsden and looked for a new lawyer to pay for his defense. Meanwhile, Milat's brothers Richard and Walter were on trial for weapons, drugs, and stolen items found on their property. His committal hearing on the murders began on October 24th and continued through December 12th, during which more than 200 witnesses appeared. Based on the evidence, he was remanded in custody until June 1995. On March 26, 1996, his trial got underway in the New South Wales Supreme Court in Sydney. He was prosecuted by Mark Tedeschi. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Milat reportedly always believed he would be found innocent. In a 2004 telephone recording made for the ABC program Australian Story, Milat explained why he believed he would be found not guilty at trial. "My basic defense at trial is not me. I don't know who did it. They're going to prove I'm guilty, not me to prove I'm innocent." His defense team argued that even though there was evidence, there wasn't any proof that Milat was guilty, and tried to make other members of his family, particularly Richard, take the blame. 145 witnesses gave testimony, including members of Milat's family who tried to provide alibis. On June 18th, Milat testified in person. After 18 weeks of testimony, the jury found Milat guilty of murder on July 27, 1996. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole on each count, as well as 6 years for attempted murder, false imprisonment, and robbery. On his first day in prison, Milat was attacked by another inmate. On May 16, 1997, he conspired with convicted drug dealer and former Sydney City Councillor George Savas to escape from prison. However, the plan ultimately failed, and George was found hanged in his cell the next day. Milat was subsequently transferred to the maximum security section of the Goulburn Correctional Center. In November 1997, Milat asked the court to reconsider his conviction because he felt his right to legal representation had been violated, as established in Dietrich v. the Queen. However, the Court of Criminal Appeal of New South Wales rejected his appeal. In 2004, Milat filed an application with the High Court of Australia for permission to appeal on new grounds. This application for leave was also ultimately rejected, upholding the decision of the Court of Criminal Appeal to dismiss his initial appeal. On October 27, 2005, in the Supreme Court of New South Wales, Milat's final avenue of appeal was denied. 2 other applications were also rejected in 2006. And one in November 2011 was similarly rejected. In the last years of his life, Milat told Australian Story that he didn't think his family was involved in the 7 murders. Milat had previously self-harmed in 2001 when he swallowed razor blades, staples, and other metal objects. In May 2011, Milat went on a 9-day hunger strike to get a PlayStation, but was unsuccessful. In May 2019, Milat was transferred to Prince of Wales Hospital in Randick, where he was diagnosed with advanced esophageal cancer. After finishing his treatment, he was transferred to Long Bay Correctional Center to continue serving his sentence. On August 9, 2019, Milat was transferred to a secure treatment unit at Prince of Wales Hospital again. He passed away on October 27th at 4:07 a.m. from esophageal and stomach cancers in the hospital wing of Long Bay Correctional Center. Before he passed away, Milat wrote a letter to his family asking the NSW government to pay for his funeral. The NSW Minister for Corrections, Anthony Roberts, turned down the request. Instead, his body was cremated, and the costs will be fully reimbursed from his prison account. In a statement, NSW police said that in Milat's final days, their officers visited him 8 times in prison and the hospital in an attempt to get him to confess. However, Milat did not confess. The police statement said that they used different tactics each time, including different combinations of detectives and taped interviews with the victim's family. However, Milat didn't provide any new information to the police during his interrogation. Although he never made a formal confession after his death, he is said to have previously admitted to his mother, who was close to him, that he was responsible for the backpacker murders. Milat was charged with 7 murders, but the police thought he might have been involved in more than that. In 1993, Task Force Air started looking into the unsolved deaths and disappearances of young people across the state. They compared Milat's known way of working and the victims he targeted to these cases. Based on the striking similarities in the way he operated, Task Force Commander Clive Small concluded that the 3 unsolved murders were probably committed by Milat. On February 26, 1971, 20-year-old Karen Rowland drove to a motel in Canberra with her sister. They both drove different cars, and a few hours later, her sister arrived at her destination while she disappeared. Later that night, her car was found on a remote back road. Milat supposedly bragged to a colleague about murdering someone and burying the body under a bush while working in Liverpool. On May 3, 1971, Karen's remains were found 15 meters from the sidewalk at the air crash memorial at Fairborn Pines Plantation near Canberra, her cause of death unknown. Peter Letcher, an 18-year-old unemployed youth, disappeared while hitchhiking back to his parents' home in Bathurst on November 13, 1987. His remains were found on January 21, 1988, by bushwalkers on a woodland trail near the Jenolan Caves tourist attraction. His body was found lying face up in a small ditch filled with leaves and branches, with a handcuff on his hand. He had been shot 5 times in the head and stabbed repeatedly in the back. Milat's ex-wife said that a few days before Letcher disappeared, he took her on a trip to the Jenolan National Forest to see a dirt road and a pine plantation. On September 6, 1991, Diane Pinocchio, 29-year-old, went to the Lake George Hotel in Bendale. Before she left, she told a friend that she planned to hitchhike back to Quimbine. She left the motel by herself and started walking towards the King's Highway around 11 p.m. On November 13, 1991, 2 Forestry Commission employees found a person wrapped in pine boughs and lying face down in the Turrigonda State Forest, about 40 kilometers south of Bingindora and southwest of Canberra. It was Pinocchio. She was wearing just her underwear and pants. She'd also suffered a spinal cord injury, which meant that even if she hadn't died, she'd have been completely paralyzed. In November 2010, Matthew, Milat's grandson, and his friend Cohen Klein attacked 17-year-old David Alcterloni in Belonglo State Forest. Matthew used a double-headed axe, and Cohen recorded the attack on his cell phone. They were sentenced to 43 and 32 years in prison, respectively, for murder in 2012. On July 18, 2005, Milat's former lawyer John Marsden made a statement at the end of his life, claiming that Milat, with the help of his sister Shirley Sawyer, had killed 2 British backpackers who, if nothing else, may have been Walters and Clark. Charles Panzram was an American serial killer with a story filled with hatred, deep loathing of society, unquenchable rage, and rebellion against authority. His methods of murder were brutal, including strangulation, poisoning, arson, slitting throats, and cracking his victims' heads with a blunt instrument. At the last moment of his life, he stood in front of the gallows like a soulless monster. He said, "I wish all mankind had one neck so I could choke it." When someone asks him if he has last words, he snarled, "Yes, hurry it up, you Hoosier bastard. I could kill a dozen men while you're fooling around." On Sunday, June 28, 1891, on a remote farm in East Grand Forks, Minnesota, a German immigrant couple gave birth to their 7th child, whom they named Charles Panzram. It was a time when most immigrant families were very poor, and Charles' family was also poor, and his parents were very mean. For example, Charles and his 6 siblings had to travel to the neighborhood school every day to get an education, but their parents brusquely demanded that they skip school and go back to work on the farm. This went on until the truancy laws came into effect, which meant Charles and his siblings could finally go to school. However, their parents were furious because they saw the children as their slaves. So they forced them to go back to the farm straight after school and work until late at night, then go straight to bed in the fields. If the children made mistakes at work, the mean parents would put them in chains and not allow them to eat. A few years later, their father left the farm without any news and never came back. He didn't leave any alimony, just leaving their mother trying to support the family alone. In fact, the 6 brothers don't get along too well because they grew up in a poor family where it seemed to them that the strong were the ones who could dominate the weak. Charles is the weakest, so he is often beaten up by his brothers for various reasons that don't make sense. Later on, Charles wrote in his autobiography, "Everyone felt free to kick and beat me as much as they wanted to cheat me and lie to me, and they thought it was perfectly normal." A year later, at the age of 8, he was taken to court for the first time on charges of drunk and disorderly behavior. 3 years later, he broke into a neighbor's house and stole some cake, apples, and a revolver. Upon returning home, he was severely beaten by his brothers. Although he gave the items to his neighbors, he was arrested for burglary. After a court trial, he was sent to the Minnesota State Correctional Institution, where there were about 300 boys, ranging in age from 10 to about 20. The rules were organized and administered by in-house personnel with no outside supervision. When Charles first arrived at the correctional facility, he was taken to a dark room where a staff member examined his penis and rectum and asked him if he had ever committed sodomy or masturbated. While he was at the correctional facility, he got a lot of training in religion. When he misbehaved or didn't finish his coursework, the strict administrators would put him in a small room to be beaten. The room was called the paint store because when the boy came out, he looked like he was covered in paint, but it was actually bruises from the beatings. Charles was abused by different staff members every day, which led to a strong dislike and hatred for the institution and for religion. He believed that these were the root causes of his misery and wanted revenge on the institution, so he built a crude incendiary bomb. On the night of July 7, 1905, he set off an incendiary bomb in the school's workshop, which started a fire that spread rapidly. The alarms of the correctional institution continued to sound, while he just lay quietly in bed, looking out through the window at the ever-growing fire and the overwhelmed administrators. A few months later, having become a cunning liar, he applied for parole from the correctional facility, and when he appeared before the parole board, he behaved like an obedient child, an example of successful rehabilitation, so he was rightfully allowed to leave the Minnesota correctional facility. Later on, Charles wrote in his autobiography, "Christians taught me how to be a hypocrite, and I learned more about stealing, lying, hating, burning, and killing, even to the point of making me understand that a boy's penis can be used for purposes other than peeing." When Charles returned home, he learned that 4 of his 5 brothers had fled the family home, that another had died in a drowning accident, and that his mother's mental state had become very fragile. Charles said in his autobiography that, "Mother was too dumb to know anything good to teach me," he said years later. "There was little love lost. I first liked her and respected her. My feelings gradually turned from that to distrust, dislike, disgust, and from there it was very simple for my feelings to turn into positive hatred towards her." Charles returned to the farm, but he didn't want to do hard manual labor, so he convinced his mother to send him to the nearby Emmanuel Lutheran Church. There, he got into an argument with a teacher who repeatedly beat him with a whip, so he managed to get his hands on a pistol and brought it to the church, where he tried to kill the teacher in front of everyone, but he accidentally lost the pistol, a plot that failed, and then he was kicked out of school and returned to the farm. 2 weeks later, he hopped on a freight train and left the Minnesota farm for good. He became a drifter, but it wasn't long time, he says. He was gang raped by 4 tramps. It left him traumatized and angrier than ever. He was sentenced to a year in prison at the Montana State Reform School for burglary within months. He weighed close to 180 pounds at the time, which drew special attention from prison guards. One of them targeted Charles, beating him repeatedly. Charles was furious and found a hard board. In the evening, he took advantage of the guard's turn to sneak attack on him and seriously injured him. And then he was held in solitary confinement for a period of time. In 1907, Charles escaped from prison with another inmate, Jimmy Benson. They stole a couple of pistols from a nearby town and headed for Terrytown. Over the next few weeks, they stole and set fires as they roamed around. When they reached western Minnesota, they each took 2 handguns and hundreds of dollars and parted ways in Fargo. Charles then changed his name to Jefferson Baldwin. In December, he arrived in Helena, Montana, a town with virtually no law enforcement and where the locals went out every day wearing handguns. One night at a local bar, Charles heard a speech by a local Army recruiter. That night, he lied about his age to join the U.S. Army, where he was assigned to Fort William Henry Harrison, a remote post in western Montana. On his first day of enlistment, he was charged with insubordination for refusing to work. Over the next month, he was incarcerated several times for a variety of minor offenses, such as frequent drunkenness, disobedience of orders, and failure to observe military discipline. In April 1908, he stole $88 worth of clothes and was caught by military police while trying to escape. At his court-martial on April 20th, he admitted to 3 counts of theft. In May, he was handcuffed and shackled and taken to the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth. There, he was beaten on numerous occasions and his feet were chained to a 50-pound metal ball that could not be removed, even when he slept at night. At the time, his job was to collect rocks in a quarry, working 10 hours a day, 7 days a week. Day after day, he became increasingly bitter and angry. Charles was released from prison in August 1910 when he was only 19 years old and had no literacy skills to find suitable work. And he had suffered years of physical and mental abuse with no family to care for him. Therefore, he decided to take revenge on the society and go to hell with others. In the summer of 1911, Charles was arrested for stealing a bicycle in Fresno, California. He was sentenced to 6 months in prison, but he escaped a month later, and then he climbed aboard a freight train heading northwest, taking some guns with him. When he saw 2 vagabonds also hiding on this train, he tried to rape them, but a railroad policeman also entered the train and tried to extort money from them. But he took out a pistol and threatened the unsuspecting policeman and took his watch and wallet, and in addition to this, he raped the policeman, and then he drove all these people off the train and continued his drifting career. In 1913, under the alias Jack Allen, he was arrested in the Dalles, Oregon, for highway robbery, assault, and sodomy of his victims. 2 months later, he managed to escape from prison and was then arrested in Harrison, Idaho. He escaped again, but was arrested again in Chinook, Montana, that time serving a 1-year sentence at the Montana State Penitentiary for burglary. He managed to escape again on November 13th, but within a week he was arrested again for burglary in a small town called Three Forks and sentenced to 1 year's imprisonment under the name of Jefferson Rhodes. On March 3, 1915, Charles got out of jail with a new suit of clothes and $5 and a ticket to a town 6 miles away. He traveled by rail through Washington, Idaho, Nebraska, and South Dakota. On June 1st, he broke into a house in Astoria, Oregon, and was caught while trying to sell some of the stolen items. On June 24th, he arrived at the Oregon State Penitentiary, and when he registered his information, he said he was from Alabama and that his job was stealing. Charles's disciplinary record shows that on January 1st, 1916, he was tied to a post for injuring a prisoner with a hammer, causing a disturbance in his cell, and verbally abusing an officer in public. A month later, he was punished again for attempting to escape and carrying a dangerous weapon. Despite the regular punishments, he kept on with his behavior. In fact, he got the idea that he wanted to take revenge. So, over the next few days, he started several fires in different parts of the prison and also burned down 3 buildings. But this led to him being put in a darkened room without a single light until 2 months later, when he was transferred to a regular cell. In 1917, he helped a prisoner named Otto Hooker escape, but this prisoner shot and killed the prison warden during his subsequent escape. The murder caused such an uproar that the prison's guards became stricter, and 24-hour round-the-clock patrols were introduced. Charles got out of prison on September 18th, and then he also broke into a house and stole some clothes, food, money, and a .38 caliber pistol. A few days later, a police officer recognized Charles from a wanted poster and tried to arrest him. Charles then pulled out a gun and opened fire on the officer, but he was arrested again because he ran out of ammunition. He managed to escape from the Oregon State Penitentiary for the second time on May 12, 1918. He sawed through the bars of a window and jumped right off the wall. The prison guards who arrived on the scene kept shooting at him, but he still managed to escape. In August 1920, he saw a luxurious house at 113 Whitney Avenue, so he broke a window and tried to steal something valuable. Then he found a large amount of jewelry, bonds, and a .45 caliber automatic pistol in the study instead. After taking what he could, he left with a bag of stolen goods. He went to Manhattan's Lower East Side, where he sold most of the jewelry and bonds. He used the money to buy a yacht he named Akista. As Charles wanders aimlessly through the streets, he comes up with a plan to rob and murder. He hires a couple of sailors, takes them to his yacht, gets them drunk, then sexually assaults, robs, and kills them. Over the course of a few weeks, he kept going into the South Street neighborhood and picking his victims. All he had to do was say that he needed some sailors on his yacht and promise good pay, and plenty of people would want to apply for the job. Charles said he'd go to New York every day or two, look for sailors in the area around 25 South Street. Once he had convinced them to come on board his yacht, he had served them some good food and drinks. When they were so drunk, they'd go to bed, and when they were asleep, he'd take out his .45 caliber automatic pistol and end their lives, and then take a stone and tie it to each of his victims before throwing them into the sea. When a major storm hit in late August 1920, the Akista crashed to pieces on the rocks and Charles swam to shore and barely escaped. In 1921, he was sentenced to 6 months in prison in Bridgeport, Connecticut, for burglary and unlawful possession of a loaded pistol. After completing his sentence, he joined a maritime union involved in a labor strike. During a confrontation, he was arrested again for participating in a shootout with police. He then escaped from prison and fled Connecticut, and a few days later he made his way to Africa. At that time, he started working for the Sinclair Oil Company. While he was working in a small coastal town near Luanda, a young black boy of about 12 years of age came to stop him from doing his job. He then took the boy to the Sinclair Oil Company grounds, where he sexually assaulted and stoned the boy to death. After the murders, he returned to Lobito Bay on the Atlantic coast and lived in a fishing village for several weeks. The locals thought he might have been involved in the murders, but they never could prove it. A few weeks later, Charles hired 6 locals to take him into the jungle to hunt crocodiles. They rode into the jungle, and when the 6 locals went down to the river, Charles took his gun and shot them one by one in the back. Even though they were all on the ground, he took his gun and shot them again in the back of the head, and then he threw them into the river to feed the crocodiles. Charles later said, "To some ordinary people, killing 6 people at once seems like an almost impossible feat, but to me, killing those 6 black men was very simple." After that, Charles went north along the Congo River, On the way, he robbed some farmers in a local village and got enough money to buy a boat ticket to the Canary Islands. But there, he couldn't find anyone worth robbing, so he got on a ship that was headed for Lisbon, Portugal. When he got there, he found out that the local authorities knew about his crimes in Africa. So he managed to hide on another ship that was going to the United States. He came back to the United States in the summer of 1922. Charles' life has been pretty chaotic, to say the least. He's never stayed in one place for too long, and he knows the police are always on his trail, ready to arrest him for crimes he committed months or even years ago. So when he commits a crime, he leaves the scene quickly. He might hop on a train, stow away on a cargo ship, or hitchhike. On July 18th, on a hot afternoon, he met a 12-year-old boy named George Henry McMahon. This little boy usually spent his time in a neighbor's restaurant until Mrs. Margaret Lyons, the owner of the restaurant, sent him to run an errand. It was about 2:15 p.m. Mrs. Lyons let George to the A&P store for milk and gave him 15 cents before he left the restaurant and headed down Boston Street. About an hour later, another neighbor, Mrs. Margaret Crean, saw George walking down the street with a man wearing a blue suit and hat. That man was Charles, and he walked with George to a nearby store where he even ventured to talk to the clerk. A few minutes later, he convinced George to take the trolley bus. They got off the train about a mile from where they boarded and went to a pretty isolated part of town. They stayed there for about 3 hours. During that time, Charles sexually assaulted George 6 times, then smashed his head with a rock and shoved several pieces of the paper torn from magazines down his throat. After that, he covered George's body with a tree branch and left the scene pretty quickly. As he was leaving the scene, 2 local residents happened to be passing by and noticed the nervous stranger. However, the 2 residents didn't think anything unusual was going on. After the murder, Charles returned to New York. George's body was found on July 21st. The local police and community formed a search party and detained any suspicious strangers they found. This included a pedophile who had attacked several local children. But it wasn't until 1928 when Charles was detained for another murder in Washington, D.C., and after those 2 witnesses saw him again, that they were certain that George's killer was the same man. On the night of August 26, 1923, he broke into the train station with an axe. There were dozens of suitcases there at the time, and he intended to steal some money from them. He had already opened a few suitcases when a policeman on early morning patrol passed by. The policeman had a gun in his hand, but he wasn't afraid. He took an axe and fought with the policeman. The officer overpowered him and took him to the Boston Road police station. There, he identified himself as John O'Leary and was charged with 3 other burglaries after admitting to the earlier thefts. The next morning at the courthouse, the judge set his bail at $5,000 and sent him to the county jail to wait for the grand jury proceedings to start. While he was in jail, Charles knew he couldn't turn back because the Oregon State Police were after him. And he'd already committed a lot of undetected burglaries and robberies in Kingston and on his trip up the Hudson River. So he told the prison guards that he was a fugitive from Oregon, serving a 17-year sentence for shooting at police. The Larchmont police then sent an inquiry wire to Oregon, and on August 29th, they received a reply in which he learned that Charles, known in Oregon as Jefferson Baldwin, was a highly wanted fugitive with 14 years left on his sentence. A few weeks later, Charles was indicted by a grand jury for the Larchmont burglary. He thought he had made a deal with the prosecuting attorney to get a shorter sentence by pleading guilty. However, the prosecutor failed to perform and he pleaded guilty but was sentenced to 5 years. In October 1923, he was sent to Dannemora prison, where the guards mistreated him. They stripped him naked and took his property. He tried to make incendiary bombs to burn down the workshop, but the guards caught him. He also tried to attack the guard, but also failed. The work in the prison was very hard, and the food was terrible, so he tried to escape. But during the escape, he fell down and was seriously injured. He didn't get timely medical attention, so he was crippled in one leg and had one of his testicles cut off during an operation. Even so, he kept up his evil deeds, sodomizing prisoners and plotting various mass murder plans, such as blowing up railroad tunnels and bridges and poisoning the water supply in the village of Dannemora. When Charles was released from Dannemora prison in July 1928, having survived 5 years, he was determined to get revenge for his treatment at Dannemora. In just 2 weeks, he committed a dozen burglaries and killed at least 1 man. However, he was arrested and sent to the Washington, D.C. prison, where he made comments about killing children, which caught the attention of the guards. Soon, other states launched investigations, and a number of other jurisdictions viewed him as a wanted and dangerous person. At the time, there was a 26-year-old guard at the prison named Henry Lesser. He was the child of Jewish immigrants. When Charles was being processed, Lesser asked him what crime he had committed. Charles laughed and said he was reforming the people. In the weeks that followed, Lesser noticed that the odd man rarely talked. He tried to escape by peeling back the concrete around the window bars, but the other inmates tipped off the guards, and then the guards handcuffed Charles to a wooden pole and tortured him for a day and a half. During that time, he cursed his parents and threatened to kill everyone when he got the chance. That very night, Charles confessed to multiple murders of young boys, and the news was picked up by the media. The Washington Post also reported on the multiple murders he confessed to, including the murder of the Philadelphia newspaper boy and George Henry McMahon of New Salem, Connecticut. He just kept talking more and more without showing any remorse. For some reason, Lesser, who works at the prison, is sympathetic towards Charles, who is disliked by the other inmates, but he helps Charles buy cigarettes. In return, Charles agrees to write his own life story for Lesser. With a pen and paper, he describes his past, which is filled with hatred, depravity, and murder. Beginning with his birth on a farm in rural Minnesota, Charles recounts thousands of crimes and dozens of murders committed between 1903 and his detention in a Washington, D.C. prison. He blamed his surroundings for his current state, and he believed that other people made him who he was. Charles wrote a 20,000-word confession that included details about the murders, which have since been confirmed. He also discussed his history of arrests in the 1900s and 1930s. At the time, communication between law enforcement agencies was limited, which made it easy for criminals to avoid capture by changing their names, because Charles was arrested under multiple names. Charles doesn't just write about his life. He also speaks out against the criminal justice system and the influence of society. He believes that these factors contribute to crime rather than reducing it. He argues that society creates criminals, and he attributes his violent behavior to those who tormented and punished him. He also talks about his criminal journey across several continents without feeling guilty or remorseful. He felt that crime and violence were his way of responding to the world, and he didn't care if his victims were involved in his suffering. He believed that someone always had to pay. On the evening of October 29, 1928, Charles was indicted for murder in Philadelphia. He was in jail in Washington, D.C. at the time, and the indictment charged him with strangling Alexander Ushek on July 26, 1928, on Point House Road. Meanwhile, after the Salem, Massachusetts Police Department got wind of Charles' arrest and confession, the chief of police had two witnesses to the 1922 murder of George Henry McMahon come forward for identification. Both witnesses then confirmed that Charles was the man they had seen that day. The Washington police were also contacted by the Oregon State Penitentiary, who asked that Charles be held as a fugitive from justice. On November 12, 1928, Charles was found guilty, and Judge Walter McCoy sentenced him to 15 years for the first count and 10 years for the second, to be served consecutively, which meant he would spend 25 years in the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas. In 1929, perhaps Charles also realized that there was no longer any possibility of him escaping, so he wrote a letter to Salem District Attorney Clark, in which he confessed to George's murder, added that he had committed a total of 21 murders, and threatened them that he would continue to kill people if he ever got free. At the prison, Charles is assigned to the laundry, where he is responsible for organizing and washing prisoners' clothing. His supervisor, Robert Warnke, is a short, bald man convicted of minor infractions who often uses his supervisory position to abuse his power. From the beginning, the relationship between Charles and Warnke was very bumpy. Because of him, Charles received many written warnings and was also held in solitary confinement. When he was released from solitary confinement for the last time, Charles told the other inmates to stay away from Warnke, saying that he wouldn't live long. He also hinted at a new move in a letter to Lesser, stating that he was ready to change things and wouldn't be long. On June 20th, 1929, while Charles was working in the laundry room, he picked up the 4-foot iron bar that was leaning against the door to support a wooden crate, then raised the bar high in the air and smashed it into Warnke's head, which instantly cracked Warnke's skull. He roared, "This is for you, son of a bitch." The trial began on April 14th, 1930, and the judge asked Charles if he had an attorney, to which he replied that he did not need one. The judge suggested that he could accept free appointed counsel, and he cursed the judge loudly. Asked to plead guilty, he snarled at the court, "I plead not guilty. You guys prove me guilty." The prosecutor then called a number of witnesses, including the warden, 5 guards, and 10 inmates. They all said that they saw Charles repeatedly hit an iron bar into the unconscious Warnke's skull. In the end, Charles was sentenced to death and was executed on September 5, 1930. He saw the death penalty as a relief and resisted calls for a moratorium on executions. He said he was looking forward to being executed and was angry with organizations that petitioned for his pardon or commutation of his sentence. On May 23rd, he wrote to the Association for the Abolition of the Death Penalty. He expressed his gratitude for their efforts and hoped that they would be strangled by themselves one day. On May 30th, he wrote to the president to express his satisfaction with the trial and judgment and reject any pardon or sentence reduction. On Friday, September 5, 1930, Charles was taken out of his cell to the gallows. Before his death, he was still cursing his mother and all mankind. Jeffrey Dahmer, the American serial killer, is responsible for the deaths of 17 men, the majority of whom were African American, over a period of 13 years. He was also known by the chilling nickname, the Milwaukee Monster. Of even greater concern, however, was his other nickname, the Cannibal of Milwaukee. Jeffrey was given the sobriquet the Cannibal of Milwaukee due to his preoccupation with corpses. He selected his victims from gay bars, shopping malls, and bus stops, enticed them with promises of remuneration or sexual intercourse, and attempted to persuade them to consume alcohol. He would then administer a drug to the victims via alcohol, subsequently strangling them. Following this, Jeffrey would engage in sexual activity with the bodies, dismembering them once he had finished. On occasion, he would retain the hearts, livers, and other organs of his victims for the purpose of cooking and consuming them, a practice that reflected his deeply perverted mindset. One murder in Jeffrey's criminal career was carried out with the inadvertent assistance of police officers. Konarak Synthesomphone, whose family immigrated to the United States from Laos in 1979 in pursuit of a better quality of life, established a residence in the Laotian neighborhood of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Life in the United States was not straightforward for the family, but over the following years, the majority of the family members acquired proficiency in the English language and integrated into American culture. They resided there contentedly. However, they encountered Jeffrey, who was a malefactor and sexual predator. In 1988, Konarak's brother, Somsak, encountered Jeffrey. At that time, Somsak was only 13 years old, and Jeffrey had already perpetrated 4 homicides. Somsak was lured to Jeffrey's apartment for a nude photo shoot, where Somsak was drugged and subsequently assaulted by Jeffrey. Fortunately, Somsak was able to escape Jeffrey's control. Subsequently, the police were informed of the incident and arrested Jeffrey on September 27, 1988. In January 1989, Jeffrey entered a guilty plea to charges of second-degree sexual assault and enticing a child to engage in immoral conduct. He was ultimately sentenced to 1 year's imprisonment with work release and 5 years probation in May of the same year. Additionally, the judge required Jeffrey to register as a sex offender. While on probation, however, on May 26, 1991, Jeffrey met Konarak at a shopping center. At the time, Konarak was experiencing financial difficulties, and thus, he agreed to the proposition of Jeffrey, who offered to take nude photographs and pay Konarak a sum of money. He reluctantly accepted, and he was then taken back to Jeffrey's apartment. There, Konarak endured the same torture his brother had suffered before. On the morning of May 27, 1991, Jeffrey's neighbor contacted the police to report a situation that had arisen. The neighbor stated that they had observed a young man who was naked, bleeding, and severely injured, and that he required immediate assistance. The individual in question was Konarak, who was unclothed, coated in blood, and visibly distressed as he stood stationary beneath Jeffrey's residence. Upon arrival at the scene, the police were informed by Jeffrey that Konarak was his 19-year-old boyfriend who had been drinking. Despite objections from several African Americans present, the police proceeded to return Konarak to Jeffrey's apartment. Subsequently, approximately 30 minutes later, Konarak succumbed to his injuries and died. Jeffrey was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. His father, Lionel Dahmer, was pursuing his degree at the time of Jeffrey's birth, and his mother, Joyce Flint, had obtained a master's degree in counseling. Indeed, Joyce exhibited paranoid tendencies early in her pregnancy and was subsequently diagnosed with hypochondria after giving birth to Jeffrey. This resulted in a need for constant attention as her condition deteriorated, necessitating her confinement to bed. Due to her emotional instability, she frequently engaged in disputes with her husband and neighbors and attempted suicide on multiple occasions without success. In October 1966, the family relocated to Ohio. At the time, his mother Joyce was scheduled to give birth in December, and Jeffrey was permitted to select the name for his new brother. He chose the name David. In the same year, Lionel obtained his degree and commenced employment as a chemical analyst. Jeffrey, however, underwent a double hernia operation that year, It may be posited that the trauma of the operation and the coldness of his parents contributed to the transformation of a child who had been described from an early age as an energetic and happy child into one who became markedly introverted and psychologically distorted. He developed an interest in matters pertaining to mortality, particularly the carcasses of animals. However, his peculiar fascination with the deceased may have originated from observing his father extracting animal bones from the soil during his early years. Lionel reported that Jeffrey was strangely aroused by the sound of bones crashing together and became fixated on it. Consequently, he occasionally searched for additional bones in the house and investigated animal tracks to ascertain the location of their bones. In May 1968, the family relocated to Bath Township, Summit County, Ohio, where their residence was situated on an acre and a half of forested land. In close proximity to the residence was a cabin, which Jeffrey utilized as his clandestine base of operations. Rather than serving as a venue for repose, the cabin was a repository for the carcasses of sizable insects and diminutive animals, including chipmunks and squirrels. 2 years later, during a dinner, Jeffrey inquired of Lionel what would occur if he placed chicken bones in bleach. Lionel, amused by Jeffrey's interest, proceeded to demonstrate the safe bleaching and preservation of animal bones. While Jeffrey retained this knowledge, he also initiated the collection of deceased animals, which he subsequently dissected and buried in close proximity to the hut, with the animal's skull occasionally positioned on a rudimentary cross. By the age of 14, Jeffrey began consuming beer and hard liquor during the day, often concealing the beverages in his jacket, which he wore to school. When one of his classmates inquired about his decision to drink, Jeffrey exhibited a lack of concern and asserted that alcohol was a substance that could facilitate healing. Upon reaching puberty, Jeffrey came to recognize his homosexual orientation. Rather than disclosing this information to his parents, he chose to maintain its secrecy. During his teenage years, Jeffrey engaged in a brief romantic relationship with a male adolescent, though they did not engage in sexual intercourse. However, according to Jeffrey's own account, he experienced fantasies of exerting dominance and control over a male partner who was entirely submissive. At approximately 16 years of age, Jeffrey encountered a male runner with whom he developed a profound fascination. He subsequently attempted to ambush the individual in a neighborhood where he frequently traversed, intending to subdue him with a wooden stick. Fortunately for the runner, Jeffrey's efforts that day were unsuccessful, as the runner was not passing through that particular area. This incident marked the inaugural instance of Jeffrey's attempts to confront the object of his fantasies. At the age of 17, Jeffrey's academic performance declined significantly. His parents engaged the services of a private tutor, yet there was only a modest improvement in his grades. In that same year, Jeffrey's parents considered divorce due to their frequent arguments that had persisted for over a decade. However, for the sake of their 2 children, they decided to save the marriage. In September 1977, Lionel discovered that Joyce had engaged in a brief affair and filed for divorce in court. In May 1978, Jeffrey graduated from high school. A few weeks prior to graduation, one of his teachers observed him consuming several cans of beer in the vicinity of the school parking lot. Upon being confronted about this incident, Jeffrey informed the teacher that he was experiencing significant challenges at home and that the school's guidance counselor was aware of these difficulties. Upon reaching the age of 18, Jeffrey remained at home. On July 24, 1978, his parents were officially divorced, with Joyce awarded custody and alimony for David. 3 weeks after graduation, Jeffrey perpetrated his first murder. On June 18, 1978, Jeffrey encountered a boy named Stephen Mark Hicks, who was 18 years old, the legal age of majority. At the time, Stephen was en route to a rock music festival in the nearby town of Lockwood Corners. On the way, given that Stephen was not wearing a shirt, Jeffrey was aroused sexually and decided to give him a ride. Jeffrey then lured Stephen to his house for a drink, citing the need to consume alcohol before attending the rock festival. They listened to music and consumed alcohol and conversed in the room. Throughout this time, Stephen discussed women at length, while Jeffrey observed him with a gaze that seemed to convey affection. Several hours later, as Stephen was preparing to depart, Jeffrey struck him twice in the head from behind with a 10-pound dumbbell. Stephen collapsed immediately to the ground, rendered unconscious. Due to the influence of sexually generated lust, Jeffrey proceeded to strangle Stephen with the dumbbell. He then proceeded to remove Stephen's clothing and engage in repeated acts of desecration against Stephen's body. Subsequently, Jeffrey transported the corpse to the basement, where he proceeded to dissect it the following day. He then placed the dismembered remains in a garbage bag and buried them in the backyard of the residence. In an effort to remove incriminating evidence, Jeffrey exhumed the body a few weeks later. He then dissolved the flesh remaining on the body in sulfuric acid, broke the bones with a sledgehammer, and scattered them in the woods in the backyard. Finally, he discarded Stephen's belongings and the knife in the river. 6 weeks after Stephen's murder, Jeffrey's father, Lionel, and his fiancée returned home. That August, Jeffrey applied to Ohio State University, but he continued to consume alcohol in excess. On one occasion, Lionel paid Jeffrey a surprise visit, only to find empty liquor bottles strewn about Jeffrey's room. In January 1979, Jeffrey enlisted in the U.S. Army, following his father Lionel's urging. He completed basic training at Fort McClellan, Alabama, and was subsequently trained as a medical specialist at Fort Sam Houston, Texas. While stationed, Jeffrey was frequently reprimanded for alcohol-related misconduct, and on one occasion, insubordination resulted in the entire platoon being punished. On July 13, 1979, Jeffrey was deployed to Baumholder, West Germany, where he served as a combat medic with the 2nd Battalion, 68th Armored Regiment, 8th Infantry Division. In the initial period of his military service, Jeffrey was evaluated as an average or slightly above average soldier. However, his performance subsequently declined due to the impact of his alcohol dependency. Following his discharge from the Army on March 24, 1981, Jeffrey was sent to Fort Jackson, South Carolina, for debriefing and was provided with a plane ticket to any location within the United States. Subsequently, Jeffrey informed the authorities that he was unable to return to his father's residence. Consequently, he opted to proceed to Miami Beach, Florida, motivated by a desire to escape the cold and to live according to his own principles. In Florida, Jeffrey secured employment at a delicatessen and leased a room at a nearby motel. However, due to his problematic alcohol consumption, he was promptly evicted from the motel for non-payment. Thereafter, he spent a period of time on the beach until he contacted his father and requested to return to Ohio in September of that year. Upon his return to Ohio, Jeffrey initially resided with his father and stepmother. As a consequence of his persistent alcohol consumption and disruptive behavior, he was fined $60 and sentenced to a 10-day suspended jail term. Lionel also endeavored to assist Jeffrey in cessation of his alcohol consumption, but was ultimately unsuccessful. In December 1981, Jeffrey was assigned to live with his maternal grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin. His maternal grandmother was the only family member with whom he exhibited positive affect, and the family hoped that her influence and the change in environment would motivate him to cease drinking, secure employment, and lead a responsible life. Initially, Jeffrey's living arrangement with his maternal grandmother was relatively harmonious. He accompanied her to church, performed household chores, actively sought employment, and followed most of her household rules. However, he continued to consume alcohol and smoke cigarettes. In early 1982, Jeffrey obtained employment as a blood piercer at a plasma center in Milwaukee. However, he was unable to maintain this position for more than 10 months. Following the termination of his employment, Jeffrey remained unemployed for over 2 years, relying solely on financial assistance from his grandmother. On August 8, 1982, Jeffrey was observed engaging in inappropriate sexual behavior at the Wisconsin State Fair Park. He was seen exposing himself on the south side of the Coliseum, where 25 individuals, including women and children, were present. As a result of this incident, he was convicted and fined $50. In January 1985, Jeffrey was gainfully employed as a bartender at a chocolate factory, where he worked 6 days a week from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., with Saturday nights off. Shortly after Jeffrey commenced his new position, he was subjected to an incident of sexual harassment. He was molested by another man while reading at the public library, and a stranger threw a note at Jeffrey, proposing to perform ventriloquism for him. Despite his initial lack of response, the incident nevertheless triggered the re-emergence of fantasies of control and domination that he had developed during his teenage years. He then commenced a regular pattern of visits to Milwaukee's gay bars, gay bathhouses, and bookstores. Additionally, he procured a mannequin from a men's store and retained it in his residence for sexual gratification. However, it was subsequently discovered and discarded by his maternal grandmother. On September 8, 1986, Jeffrey was arrested and initially charged with lewd and lascivious conduct for masturbating in public and exposing himself to 2 12-year-old boys. Initially, Jeffrey claimed that he was merely urinating and was unaware of the witnesses. Despite being unaware of the witnesses, Jeffrey subsequently admitted to the crime. The charge was subsequently altered to disorderly conduct, and on March 10, 1987, Jeffrey was sentenced to 1 year's probation, with an additional stipulation that he would receive counseling. On November 20, 1987, Stephen Twomey, then 25 years of age, encountered Jeffrey at a bar in West Allis, Wisconsin. Jeffrey persuaded Twomey to return to the Ambassador Hotel in Milwaukee, where Twomey had previously rented a room. In his statement to the authorities following his arrest, Jeffrey asserted that he did not intend to kill Twomey. Instead, he had planned to drug Twomey and lie next to him. However, the following morning, upon awakening, Jeffrey discovered Twomey lying on the bed beneath him. Twomey's chest was crushed, his body exhibited bruising in multiple locations, and blood was flowing from the corners of his mouth. Jeffrey's own fists and one of his forearms bore severe bruising. Subsequently, Jeffrey procured a sizable suitcase and conveyed Twomey's corpse to his maternal grandmother's residence. 1 week later, he proceeded to dismember Twomey's body, including the head, arms, and legs. He then separated the bones from the body and divided the meat into smaller portions, for the meat was then placed in a plastic garbage bag, while the bones were wrapped in a sheet and broken with a sledgehammer. The dismemberment process took approximately 2 hours. All of Twomey's remains were disposed of, except for her head, which was discarded in the trash. 2 weeks later, Jeffrey employed an alkaline industrial detergent and boiling with bleach in an attempt to preserve the skull, which he then utilized as a masturbatory stimulus. Ultimately, the skull became too brittle as a result of this bleaching process, and Jeffrey crushed it and disposed of it. 2 months later, Jeffrey encountered James Dockstader, a 14-year-old Native American. According to the profile, Dockstader was a runaway teenager whom Jeffrey met outside a bus stop in West Allis, which is situated in proximity to a gay bar. Jeffrey lured Dockstader to his grandmother's residence, offering him $50 in exchange for posing for nude photographs. Once at Jeffrey's residence, Jeffrey engaged in sexual activity with Dockstader. Subsequently, Jeffrey strangled him on the cellar floor, having previously drugged Dockstader. Jeffrey left the body in the cellar for approximately 1 week and then dismembered it in a manner consistent with Twomey's method. He discarded the majority of Dockstader's remains, with the exception of the skull, which he placed in the trash. The skull was subsequently boiled and cleaned with bleach, but not before Jeffrey recognized that the process rendered the skull too brittle, leading him to ultimately crush it. On March 24, 1988, Jeffrey encountered Richard Guerrero, a 22-year-old bisexual male, outside a gay bar designated as the Phoenix. Jeffrey continued to entice Guerrero to return to his grandmother's residence, offering him $50 and the prospect of spending the night. Once there, Jeffrey administered a dose of sleeping pills and subsequently strangled him with a belt before desecrating the body. Within 24 hours of the murder, Jeffrey proceeded to dismember his body and discard the remains in a trash receptacle. He also retained Guerrero's skull, though he ultimately crushed it several months later. On April 23, 1988, Jeffrey met Ronald Flowers Jr., a 22-year-old. He lured Flowers to his grandmother's residence and provided him with a cup of coffee that had been drugged. As Jeffrey prepared to perpetrate the murder, they heard Jeffrey's grandmother call out, "Is that you, Jeff?" Although Jeffrey's response leads his grandmother to believe he is alone, she subsequently becomes aware of the presence of other individuals in the vicinity. Consequently, rather than proceeding with the planned murder of Flowers, Jeffrey instead transports him to County General Hospital, where he loses consciousness. Flowers was one of the individuals whom Jeffrey had identified as a potential victim, but who ultimately survived and evaded Jeffrey's grasp. In September 1988, Jeffrey's maternal grandmother requested that he vacate the premises, citing concerns about his alcohol consumption, his habit of bringing young men to her house late at night, and the unpleasant odor emanating from the basement and garage. Subsequently, Jeffrey leased a one-bedroom apartment at 808 North 24th Street. 2 days later, he was apprehended by the authorities for drugging and sexually assaulting a 13-year-old boy named Somsak. Jeffrey's father retained the services of attorney Gerald Boyle to represent his son. At Gerald's request, Jeffrey underwent a series of psychological evaluations prior to a court hearing. The evaluations indicated that Jeffrey's emotional state was abnormal. 2 months later, a second evaluation revealed that Jeffrey exhibited impulsivity, suspicious behavior toward others, and frustration with his perceived lack of accomplishments in life. Additionally, his probation officer noted that in 1987, Jeffrey had been diagnosed with schizoid personality disorder. On March 20th, Jeffrey relocated to his maternal grandmother's residence. 2 months prior to his conviction and sentencing, Jeffrey perpetrated the murder of his fifth victim, Anthony Sears, a 24-year-old mixed-race aspiring model. According to Jeffrey, he did not intend to commit a crime that night. Rather, he claimed that Sears initiated an exchange with him. Jeffrey then lured Sears to his grandmother's home, where they engaged in oral sex. Following this, Jeffrey proceeded to strangle Sears, The following morning, Jeffrey placed Sears's body in a bathtub, decapitated it, and attempted to remove the skin. He removed the flesh from the body, broke the bones, and discarded the resulting parts in the trash. However, Jeffrey found Sears's body so attractive that Sears became the first victim to have any body parts permanently retained by Jeffrey. These included the head and genitals, which Jeffrey preserved in acetone and stored in a wooden crate. This he kept in his work locker. When he moved to a new apartment the following year, he took the wooden box with him. On May 14, 1990, Jeffrey relocated from his grandmother's residence to an apartment at 924 North 25th Street in Milwaukee. This new residence, situated in a high-crime area, offered several advantages for Jeffrey. It was in close proximity to his place of employment, was fully furnished, and had a rent of only $300 per month, which included all utilities except electricity. This made it an affordable option for Jeffrey. In the week following his relocation to the new apartment, Jeffrey proceeded to murder his sixth known victim, 32-year-old Raymond Smith. Smith was a sex worker whom Jeffrey lured to his apartment for $50 with the promise of sexual intercourse. Once Smith was inside the apartment, Jeffrey gave him a drink laced with sleeping pills. After Smith lost consciousness, Jeffrey strangled him with his hands. On the following day, Jeffrey procured a Polaroid camera, which he utilized to document the dismemberment of Smith's corpse through the capture of multiple photographic images. He then proceeded to dismember Smith's body by boiling the aforementioned legs, arms, and pelvis in a steel kettle using a soilax, an instrument designed to facilitate the rinsing of bones in a sink. The remaining skeletal remains of Smith, excluding the skull, were dissolved in an acid solution by Jeffrey, while the skull was sprayed and preserved by the same individual. Approximately 1 week after Smith's murder, on or about May 27th, Jeffrey lured another young man to his apartment. On this occasion, Jeffrey inadvertently consumed the beverage provided to his guest, resulting in the individual who had passed out assuming Jeffrey's identity. Upon regaining consciousness the following day, Jeffrey discovered that the man had stolen several articles of clothing, $300, and a watch. In June 1990, Jeffrey lured Edward Smith, a 27-year-old acquaintance, to his apartment. Once there, Jeffrey administered a drug to Edward and proceeded to strangle him manually after he lost consciousness. In contrast with his previous methodology, Jeffrey did not immediately subject Edward's corpse to acidification or bleaching. Instead, he stored the skeletal remains in a refrigerator for several months with the intention of removing moisture from the bones. However, this approach proved ineffective, and after several months, he proceeded to acidify the bones. However, during the process of disposing of Edward's body, Jeffrey experienced an incident when he attempted to dry the skull. He placed the skull in the oven, but due to mishandling, the skull exploded in the oven, resulting in the destruction of the skull. Jeffrey expressed disappointment at being unable to retain the victim's body parts as a memento. He subsequently informed the police that he experienced a sense of decay in the aftermath of Edward's murder due to his inability to retain any of the body parts. In the period of less than 3 months following the murder of Edward, Jeffrey encountered 22-year-old Ernest Miller, a man from Chicago. Miller consented to accompany Jeffrey back to his residence in exchange for $50 and permitted Jeffrey to listen to his heartbeat. However, when Jeffrey attempted to engage in oral intercourse with Miller, the latter indicated that this would require additional compensation. In response, Jeffrey provided Miller with a beverage containing 2 sleeping pills. Given that Jeffrey had only 2 sleeping pills at his disposal, the dosage was insufficient to induce unconsciousness in Miller. Consequently, he resorted to the most expedient method of killing, employing the same knife that was typically utilized for the dissection of the victim's body. He severed Miller's carotid artery, resulting in his demise within minutes due to exsanguination. Subsequently, Jeffrey posed for Miller's nude body, took suggestive Polaroids, and placed Miller's body in a bathtub for dismemberment. During the dismemberment process, Jeffrey displayed an unusual fascination with Miller's head, which he repeatedly kissed and spoke to. He also packaged several other body parts, including the heart, liver, biceps, and certain muscle parts of the legs, and stored them in plastic bags in the refrigerator for later consumption. Additionally, Jeffrey employed the use of soilax to boil the residual meat and organs, resulting in the production of a jelly-like substance. This allowed him to effectively rinse the meat off the bones, which he intended to retain. To preserve the bones, Jeffrey soaked them in a diluted bleach solution for 24 hours and then dried them on a cloth for a week. Miller's head was initially stored in a refrigerator, then skinned and enameled. 3 weeks after Miller's murder, on September 24, 1990, Jeffrey encountered David Thomas, a 22-year-old father of two, at the Avenue Mall. Jeffrey persuaded Thomas to return to his apartment for a few drinks and offered to provide additional remuneration in exchange for Thomas's willingness to pose for a photograph. In his statement to the police following his arrest, Jeffrey asserted that he had given Thomas a drink containing a sedative. He stated that he was not interested in Thomas's body, but that he was concerned about Thomas's potential anger upon waking. Consequently, he strangled Thomas and did not retain any body parts after dismembering the body. However, he documented the dismemberment process and retained the photographic evidence, which subsequently assisted the police in identifying Thomas. Jeffrey did not kill anyone for nearly 5 months following Thomas's murder. However, it was not due to a lack of desire to do so. He attempted, on at least 5 occasions between October 1990 and February 1991, to lure men to his apartment but was unsuccessful. In the course of 1990, Jeffrey frequently articulated feelings of anxiety and depression to his probation officer. He frequently referenced his sexual orientation, his solitary lifestyle, his financial challenges, and his apprehensions about reuniting with his father and brother for the forthcoming Thanksgiving holiday. On multiple occasions, he disclosed to his probation officer that he had contemplated suicide. In February 1991, Jeffrey observed 17-year-old Curtis Schroeder at a bus stop in the vicinity of Marquette University. Jeffrey enticed Schroeder to his residence with the offer of monetary compensation, proposing the performance of nude photography and, as an additional incentive, a sexual act. Subsequently, Jeffrey administered a drug to Schroeder, handcuffed his hands behind his back, and strangled him with a belt. He then proceeded to dismember Schroeder and preserved his skull, hands, and genitals while documenting each stage of the dismemberment process. On April 7, 1991, Jeffrey encountered 19-year-old Errol Lindsay as Lindsay was proceeding to cut keys. Jeffrey enticed Lindsay to his apartment, where he administered a narcotic and then drilled a hole in Lindsay's skull through which he injected hydrochloric acid. In his post-arrest statement, Jeffrey asserted that Lindsay regained consciousness after the experiment, complained of a headache, and inquired about the time of day. Jeffrey then administered another dose of the drug and proceeded to strangle him. He subsequently decapitated Lindsay and he removed Lindsay's skin and placed it in a solution of cold water and salt for several weeks, with the intention of preserving it permanently. However, when the skin became too worn and brittle, Jeffrey was compelled to dispose of it. By 1991, residents of the Oxford Apartments had begun to complain to the building manager, Sopa Princewell, about the persistent malodor emanating from Jeffrey's room, in addition to the sound of falling objects and the sporadic use of a chainsaw. Princewell contacted Jeffrey on several occasions, and he explained that the stench was caused by a break in his freezer, which caused the contents to become moldy. Subsequently, Jeffrey informed Princewell that the cause of the foul odor was the recent death of several of his tropical fish, and that he would address the matter. On May 24, 1991, Jeffrey encountered Tony Hughes, a 31-year-old aspiring model, at a nightclub. Jeffrey subsequently invited Hughes to his apartment and offered him remuneration in exchange for posing for a photograph. Subsequent to Hughes becoming unconscious from the beverage, Jeffrey administered hydrochloric acid via injection into the cranium, with the intention of rendering Hughes compliant. However, this proved ineffective, resulting in Hughes' demise. On May 26, 1991, Jeffrey perpetrated the killing of Konarak. On June 30, 1991, Jeffrey encountered 20-year-old Matt Turner at a bus stop in Chicago. Turner accepted Jeffrey's proposal to travel to Milwaukee for a professional photography session. At Jeffrey's residence, he administered a drug to Turner that rendered him unconscious and then proceeded to strangle him. Jeffrey subsequently dismembered Turner's body and placed his head and internal organs in separate plastic bags within the refrigerator. As Turner was not reported missing, his remains were not promptly searched for. On July 5th, 5 days later, Jeffrey lured 23-year-old Jeremiah Weinberger from a Chicago bar to his apartment with the promise of spending the weekend with him. Jeffrey administered a sedative to Weinberger and twice injected boiling water into his skull, which resulted in Weinberger falling into a coma and ultimately succumbing to his injuries 2 days later. On July 15, 1991, Jeffrey encountered 24-year-old Oliver Lacey, who consented to accompany him to Milwaukee for a professional photo shoot. Lacey accompanied Jeffrey back to his apartment. Subsequently, the two engaged in tentative sexual activity in the apartment before Jeffrey administered a drug to Lacey. Jeffrey had initially planned to prolong his time with Lacey. However, after failing to render Lacey unconscious with the drug, he proceeded to strangle Lacey. Subsequently, Jeffrey engaged in sexual intercourse with the corpse before proceeding to dismember it. He then placed Lacey's head and heart in the refrigerator and her skeleton in the freezer. 4 days later, on July 19th, Jeffrey was informed that he had been terminated from his position. Subsequently, Jeffrey lured 25-year-old Joseph Breithoft to his apartment. It would appear that Breithoft was also strangled, and his body remained in Jeffrey's bed for a period of 2 days. On July 21st, Jeffrey discovered the body of Breithoft, which was infested with maggots. Subsequently, Jeffrey proceeded to dismember the body, clean the head, and place it in the refrigerator. He acidified the bodies of Breithoft and 2 other victims who had been killed within the previous month. On July 22, 1991, Jeffrey extended an invitation to 3 men, offering them a $100 incentive to accompany him back to his apartment. The men were to engage in various activities, including posing nude for photographs, consuming beer, and socializing with Jeffrey. One of the men, Tracy Edwards, age 32, accepted Jeffrey's invitation and accompanied him to the apartment. Upon entering Jeffrey's apartment, Tracy observed an unpleasant odor on the floor and several boxes of hydrochloric acid, which Jeffrey asserted was utilized for the cleaning of bricks. After a brief conversation, Tracy turned his head to observe the tropical fish that Jeffrey kept. This afforded Jeffrey the opportunity to place handcuffs on his wrists. Upon inquiring about the situation, Tracy was met with an unsuccessful attempt by Jeffrey to tighten the handcuffs. He then informed Tracy of his intention to proceed to the bedroom for the purpose of posing for nude photographs. In the bedroom, Jeffrey brandished a knife and informed Tracy of his intention to take nude photographs of him. In an effort to pacify Jeffrey, Tracy proposed that he would permit Jeffrey to be photographed if he would release the handcuffs and put away the knife. Jeffrey seemed appeased by this suggestion and then directed his attention to the television. Tracy observed Jeffrey rocking back and forth and making noises, and then turned his attention back to him. Jeffrey rested his head against Tracy's chest and listened to his heartbeat, and then held the knife against him and informed Tracy of his intention to consume his heart. Tracy attempted to dissuade Jeffrey from further aggression, reiterating that he was Jeffrey's friend and would not flee. Upon stating his intention to use the bathroom, Tracy was granted permission by Jeffrey, who accompanied him on the journey to the living room. In the living room, Tracy bided his time until Jeffrey momentarily lost his focus and then requested to use the bathroom once more. Upon rising from the couch, Tracy observed that Jeffrey was no longer in possession of the handcuffs. Seizing the opportunity, Tracy struck Jeffrey in the face, causing him to lose his balance, and then fled the apartment. At 11:30 p.m. on July 22nd, Tracy encountered 2 Milwaukee police officers, Robert Roth and Rolf Mueller, at the intersection of North 25th Street. The officers observed that Tracy was restrained by handcuffs and inquired as to how they had been applied. Tracy explained that an unknown individual had placed them on him and requested assistance in removing them. However, the handcuff key proved ineffectual in this instance, prompting the officers to request Tracy's presence at the apartment. During this visit, Tracy disclosed that he had endured 5 harrowing hours in captivity prior to his escape. Upon arrival at apartment 213, the officers and Tracy were greeted by Jeffrey, who invited them inside. Jeffrey then admitted to handcuffing Tracy but did not provide an explanation for his actions. At this juncture, Tracy disclosed to the officers that Jeffrey had also secreted a knife in the bedroom. Without offering an explanation, Jeffrey informed Officer Mueller that the key to the handcuffs was located in his nightstand. Upon entering the bedroom, Mueller was instructed by Roth to refrain from retrieving the key himself. In the bedroom, Mueller observed the presence of a substantial knife beneath the bed. Additionally, he noted the presence of an open drawer containing a multitude of Polaroid photographs, many of which depicted human bodies in varying stages of dismemberment. Mueller deduced that the photographs had been taken in the apartment where they were located. He proceeded to the living room, showed the photos to his partner, and confirmed that these are real. Upon observing Mueller in possession of the Polaroids, Jeffrey attempted to resist arrest. The officers swiftly overpowered him, restraining him with handcuffs and calling for backup. At this juncture, Mueller opened the refrigerator and discovered a freshly severed head. As Jeffrey was restrained on the floor, he turned to the officers and stated, "I am deserving of death due to my actions." A more comprehensive search of the apartment conducted by the Milwaukee Police Department's Criminal Investigations Bureau yielded further evidence of human remains, including heads, bones, organs, and muscles. In addition, 74 Polaroids were discovered, which provided detailed documentation of the dismemberment of Jeffrey's victims. On July 25, 1991, Jeffrey was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. By August 22nd, he was charged with an additional 11 murders in Wisconsin. On September 14th, investigators from the state of Ohio discovered a considerable quantity of bone fragments in a wooded area situated in close proximity to the location where Jeffrey had previously confessed to killing his first victim, Stephen Hicks. Among the recovered remains were 2 molars and a vertebra bearing Hicks' X-ray record. Consequently, on September 17th, the Ohio authorities filed charges against Jeffrey for the murder of Hicks. Jeffrey was not charged with the attempted murder of Tracy Edwards, nor was he charged with the murder of Stephen Twomey. The Milwaukee County District Attorney filed only murder charges that could be proved beyond a reasonable doubt, and Jeffrey did not remember committing the murder. Additionally, there was no physical evidence to suggest guilt. At a preliminary hearing on January 13, 1992, Jeffrey entered a guilty plea on 15 counts of murder, asserting that he was insane at the time of the crimes. His trial commenced on January 30, 1992, when he was arraigned on 15 counts of first-degree murder before Judge Lawrence Graham. By entering a guilty plea on January 13th, Jeffrey relinquished his right to a trial, as defined under Wisconsin law. In the trial of Jeffrey, attorneys presented arguments regarding the presence of a mental disorder or personality disorder. The prosecution asserted that no such disorder would impair Jeffrey's capacity to recognize the criminal nature of his actions or to resist impulses. In contrast, the defense posited that Jeffrey was afflicted with a mental illness, driven by obsessions and impulses that he was unable to control. The defense presented expert testimony from Fred Berlin, Judith Becker, and Carl Wallstrom, who diagnosed Jeffrey with behavioral preference disorder. The defense also presented the expert opinion of Dr. Judith Becker, who stated that Jeffrey had a death craving and was driven by obsessions and impulses that he could not control. The prosecution's expert witnesses, including Fred Fosdal and Park Dietz, testified that they did not believe Jeffrey had any form of mental disease or defect at the time of the offense. They described Jeffrey as a thoughtful and cunning individual, capable of distinguishing right from wrong and having the ability to control his behavior. Forensic psychiatrist George Palermo and clinical psychologist Samuel Friedman provided expert testimony on Jeffrey's mental state, offering insights for both the prosecution and the defense. They posited that Jeffrey's actions were driven by repressed aggression and that he killed the men in an attempt to eliminate the source of his homosexual attraction. The trial lasted 2 weeks. In closing arguments on February 14th, defense attorney Gerald Boyle emphasized the testimony of mental health professionals who argued that Jeffrey's compulsive killings were the result of mental illness. In contrast, prosecuting attorney Michael McCann portrayed Jeffrey as a reasonable man in complete control of his behavior, who was simply trying to avoid detection. Ultimately, the jury found Jeffrey sane and not mentally impaired for each of the 15 murders, although 2 of the 12 jurors expressed their dissent on each charge. Jeffrey was sentenced to life in prison plus 10 years for the first 2 counts and a mandatory sentence of life in prison plus 70 years for the remaining 13 counts. As Wisconsin had abolished the death penalty in 1853, Jeffrey was not sentenced to death. 3 months after his conviction in Milwaukee, Jeffrey was extradited to Ohio to stand trial for the murder of his first victim, Stephen Hicks. In a court hearing that lasted a mere 45 minutes, Jeffrey once again pleaded guilty to the charges against him. As a result, on May 1, 1992, he was sentenced to his 16th life sentence. Subsequently, Jeffrey was transferred to the Columbia Correctional Institution. During his initial year of incarceration, he was placed in solitary confinement due to concerns for his personal safety. During this period, Jeffrey received a considerable number of letters from various locations around the globe. He also purchased items such as tape recorders, stationery, cigarettes, and magazines with funds donated by some of the correspondents. After a year in solitary confinement, Jeffrey was transferred to a lower security cell block and assigned the task of cleaning toilets for 2 hours per day. This was later expanded to include cleaning the prison gym. Subsequent to the completion of his comprehensive confession in 1991, Jeffrey petitioned Detective Murphy for a Bible. This request was granted, and Jeffrey subsequently embraced Christianity and became a born-again Christian. Inspired by his father, he also perused creationist literature from the Institute for Creation Research. In May 1994, Jeffrey underwent a baptism in prison, conducted by Roy Ratcliffe, a minister of the Church of Christ and alumnus of Oklahoma Christian University. Following the baptism, Ratcliffe visited Jeffrey on a weekly basis, and the two frequently discussed the inevitability of death. In the months preceding Jeffrey's murder, he had contemplated whether he was disobeying God by continuing to live. On July 3, 1994, an inmate named Osvaldo Durruti attempted to slit Jeffrey's throat with a razor hidden in a toothbrush while Jeffrey was sitting in the prison chapel after weekly church services. However, Jeffrey suffered only minor injuries and was not seriously harmed in the incident. Jeffrey's mother, Joyce, also maintained regular communication with him, despite having not seen him since Christmas of 1983. In their telephone conversations, Joyce expressed concern for her son's health, to which Jeffrey consistently responded that he was indifferent to the matter of his own mortality. On the morning of November 28, 1994, Jeffrey left his cell to perform his assigned work detail, accompanied by two cellmates, Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scarborough. The three were left unattended in the shower stalls of the prison gym for approximately 20 minutes. At approximately 8:10 a.m., Jeffrey was discovered on the floor of the gym shower, having sustained severe injuries to the head and face from a 20-inch metal bar. Additionally, his head was forcibly struck against the wall on multiple occasions throughout the course of the attack. Despite being transported to a nearby medical facility, Jeffrey was subsequently pronounced deceased an hour later. Anderson, who had also been subjected to the same form of assault, ultimately succumbed to his injuries 2 days later. Upon learning of Jeffrey's death, his mother Joyce angrily responded to the media, stating, "Has the public's outrage been assuaged? Is it sufficient that he was clubbed to death?" However, Jeffrey had previously indicated in his will that he did not desire any funeral services and wished to be cremated. In September 1995, Jeffrey's body was cremated, and his ashes were subsequently collected by his parents. Jeffrey's inner world was elusive, and some say it was his hernia surgery that led him to his twisted path. But learn more about his father's busy schedule, his mother's mental illness, the love and care that was shared by his brother, and his parents' divorce, and even news that he was sexually abused by a neighbor when he was a child. If one has to understand why he went down the path of crime, then his terrible childhood may be an answer. Ted Bundy is a serial killer who is highly proficient at disguising himself. In social situations, he is articulate and possesses a humorous and charismatic demeanor. However, in reality, he was a calculating and cunning individual. He traversed 6 states, brutally murdering over 30 young women he had never met. It was highly ironic that he had even worked for the Seattle Crime Commission, writing a rape prevention pamphlet and volunteering to publicize it. His psychology professor spoke highly of him, writing in a letter of recommendation, "Mr. Bundy is without question one of the finest graduates of our faculty. I think he is the finest kind of Centurion graduate I have ever seen at the University of Washington. He is intelligent, capable, active, conscientious, and more like a professor than a student. He loves to learn, is easy to get along with, and will work hard." Ted was born on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont, the largest city in the state. His mother was Eleanor Louise Cowell, but the identity of his father has remained unknown. There have been numerous hypotheses regarding this matter. Some hypothesize that his biological father was most likely his mother's father. Louise Cowell claims that his father was a sailor named Jack Worthington, while others hypothesize that his biological father was an Air Force veteran named Lloyd Marshall. However, none of these hypotheses have been confirmed. At this time, he was known as Theodore Robert Cowell. To circumvent potential gossip, Samuel Cowell, his maternal grandfather, asserted that Ted was his son, a claim that was accepted by the rest of the family, given that his mother was pregnant out of wedlock at the time. Some reports indicate that Samuel Cowell exhibited violent and paranoid behavior, with a history of domestic violence, including the beating of his wife. Additionally, he was known to be racially abusive, beating family members and even the family dog when he was upset. Ted's Aunt Julia also recalled that he used to place knives next to her bed and laugh at her when she was a child. In 1950, Louise relocated with Ted to Tacoma, Washington, to reside with her cousin Alan and Jane Scott, subsequently assuming the name Louise Nelson. Nevertheless, there is no definitive proof that Ted and Louise endured domestic violence. In early 1951, Louise encountered 30-year-old Johnny Culpeper Bundy, who had served in the U.S. Navy as a cook at a Methodist-sponsored church event for adult singles. The two subsequently married that same year, Following their nuptials, Johnny adopted Ted as his son and assisted him in changing his name to Theodore Robert Bundy, the same name that was subsequently utilized in police registrations. Johnny was benevolent towards Ted, frequently taking him and his own children on camping trips and other outdoor activities. Despite his efforts to integrate Ted into the family, Ted consistently maintained a distance, adhering to the belief that his surname was Cowell, not Bundy. Despite the gravity of the crime committed by Ted, both Johnny and Louise continued to hold him in high regard and never wavered in their belief in his innocence. During his high school years, Ted self-identified as a troubled individual. He engaged in risky behaviors such as loitering in the neighborhood, searching through trash for pornographic images, and looking into windows after consuming alcohol. Additionally, it was alleged that as an adolescent, he exhibited a notable degree of social withdrawal and an inability to comprehend the necessity of interpersonal relationships and social interaction. Additionally, he was arrested on at least 2 occasions on suspicion of burglary. However, the case records were subsequently expunged in accordance with Washington state law following his 18th birthday. Ted's high school classmates attested to his social adeptness and popularity, as well as his reputation for good taste in clothing and exemplary manners. Ted graduated from Woodrow Wilson High School in 1965. He was awarded a scholarship to the University of Puget Sound, where he commenced studies in psychology and Eastern studies that fall. After 2 semesters at UPS, he elected to transfer to the University of Washington in Seattle, where he planned to major in Chinese. In 1967, Ted developed a romantic interest in a fellow student, Diane Edwards, who went by the pseudonym Stephanie Brooks. She was a woman of notable beauty and elegance from a wealthy California family, and Ted was initially incredulous that she was interested in someone like him. In early 1968, Ted terminated his studies, accepted a series of low-paying positions, and served as a volunteer in the Seattle office of Republican Senator Rockefeller's presidential campaign. Additionally, he was employed as a chauffeur for Arthur Fletcher, who is regarded as the father of affirmative action in the United States, campaigned for the position of Lieutenant Governor of Washington State that year. In August of that year, Ted attended the 1968 Republican National Convention in Miami as a delegate representing Rockefeller. Subsequently, Stephanie terminated their relationship, citing Ted's immaturity and lack of ambition as the primary reasons for the dissolution. Following the separation, she returned to California. At this juncture, Ted returns to his place of birth, Burlington, Vermont, and uncovers the reality of his family's relationship. He had originally assumed that his maternal grandparents were his parents and Louise was his sister. However, he subsequently located his birth certificate, which proved that Louise was, in fact, his mother. There are multiple accounts of how he located the document. The first hypothesis is that a relative provided him with the birth certificate, and the second is that he discovered the certificate on his own. However, this resulted in Ted developing a profound animosity towards Louise, due to his perception that she had not acted in his best interests. Subsequently, a despondent Ted embarked on a period of respite in Colorado, followed by visits to relatives in Arkansas and Philadelphia. He also spent a semester at Temple University. He returned to Washington State in the fall of 1969, where he met Elizabeth Klopfer, who went by the alias Meg Anders. Meg remained in a relationship with Ted throughout the period in which he was committing the murders, yet she was unaware of his criminal activities. It was not until 1974 that she began to suspect that Ted might be the perpetrator when she observed a composite picture of the primary suspect in a newspaper and noted that it included the name Ted. Ultimately, following Ted's apprehension by the authorities, she became estranged from him and eventually disowned him emotionally. In the subsequent academic year, Ted re-enrolled at the University of Washington, majoring in psychology. This time, he distinguished himself as a gifted student, earning excellent grades and the admiration of his professors. As part of his coursework in psychology, he also served as a night volunteer at Seattle's Suicide Hotline, a suicide crisis center serving in the Seattle metropolitan and suburban areas. He encountered Ann Rule, a former Seattle policewoman and novice crime writer, who subsequently authored a biography of Ted and his criminal activities. According to the book, during this period, Ted exhibited no discernible abnormalities. Ann Rule characterizes Ted as a benevolent, sincere, and perceptive individual. In 1972, following his graduation from the University of Washington, Ted was employed by the gubernatorial campaign of Washington State Republican Party Chairman Daniel Evans. His role involved the note-taking of every speech delivered by Evans's principal opponent, former Governor Albert Rossellini, for analysis by Evans's staff team. Following Evans's successful re-election, Ted was employed as an aide to Washington State Republican Party Chairman Ross Davis. Davis held Ted in high regard, describing him as intelligent, assertive, and devout. In early 1973, despite mediocre test scores, Ted was admitted to the University of Puget Sound and the University of Utah School of Law on the basis of letters of recommendation from Evans, Davis, and several University of Washington psychology professors, ultimately selecting the University of Utah Law School. In the summer of 1973, Ted rekindled his romantic relationship with Stephanie when he traveled to California to work on Republican issues. She was surprised to find that Ted had become a conscientious, dedicated professional. Meanwhile, Ted continued to date Meg, unaware of the other woman's existence. In the fall of the same year, Ted took the relationship to the next level by convincing Stephanie to move in with him in Seattle for a period of time. The two discussed marriage after Christmas, with Ted even introducing her to Davis as his fiancée. In January 1974, Ted terminated all communication with Stephanie, neither answering her phone calls nor responding to her emails. When Stephanie finally contacted Ted by phone a month later and inquired about the reason for his abrupt change in behavior, Ted simply replied, "Stephanie, I don't know what you mean," and terminated the call. Stephanie never heard from Ted again until he was arrested. According to Ted's sources, his motivation was to prove that I could marry her. In contrast, Stephanie believes that Ted deliberately and cruelly rejected the relationship after the proposal in retaliation for her breakup in 1968. In August or September 1975, Ted became a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. However, he rarely attended services and failed to observe the majority of the church's commandments. Following his conviction for kidnapping in 1976, the LDS excommunicated him. When questioned about his religious beliefs following his arrest and during his trial, he stated that his faith was the Methodist Church, the religion of his childhood. The circumstances surrounding the inception of Ted's serial murders remain shrouded in ambiguity. He would offer conflicting accounts to different individuals and consistently evade inquiries regarding the temporal and spatial origins of these incidents. However, an investigation conducted by Detective Constable Robert Cape suggests that Ted's earliest murders may have occurred in Seattle in 1972 or in Tumwater, Washington in 1973. It is postulated by some that the disappearance of Anne Marie Burr, an 8-year-old girl from Tacoma, Washington, may be linked to Ted. Furthermore, official records indicate that Ted's first murder occurred in 1974, when he was 27 years old and had acquired expertise in forensic science, including the ability to avoid leaving incriminating evidence at the scene of a crime. From January 4, 1974 to approximately mid-June of that year, Ted perpetrated the kidnapping and murder of at least 6 female college students in a series of incidents. He gained access to the dormitories of his victims by feigning an intention to accost them and then assaulting them with a metal bat. Among those known were Linda Ann Healy, a 21-year-old student at the University of Washington pursuing a degree in psychology and broadcasting morning weather forecasts for local skiers. Donna Gail Manson, a 19-year-old student at Evergreen State University, disappeared after intending to attend a jazz concert. She was regarded as an exemplary student with a penchant for the flute and a proclivity for photography. Susan Elaine Ranko, aged 18, a student at the University of Washington, whose clothing was discovered in a washing machine following her disappearance. Witnesses recalled an individual with an injured arm approaching multiple women on campus that night, with Brenda Carroll Bauer and Georgine Hawkins among the victims. Another victim, Karen Sparks, a dance student at the University of Washington, survived her serious injuries but sustained permanent physical and psychological trauma as a result of being beaten and sexually assaulted by Ted with a metal bat. Ted was employed in Olympia, the capital of Washington State, as the assistant director of the Seattle Crime Prevention Council. Additionally, he developed a manual on rape prevention for women during his tenure at this organization. Subsequently, Ted was reassigned to a role within the state's Department of Emergency Services, DE, which was engaged in the search for missing women. During his tenure at DE, he initiated a romantic relationship with Carol Ann Boone, a divorced woman with 2 children, who assumed a significant role in his life towards the end of his life. The culminating event in the series of serial murders occurred on July 14, 1974, when 2 young women were abducted in broad daylight at Lake Sammamish State Park in Washington State. 6 eyewitness accounts indicate that an attractive young male approached them and requested assistance in unloading his sailboat. 4 declined, while 2 followed him to his vehicle and promptly fled upon realizing that there was no sailboat. The vehicle in question was a brown or bronze-colored Fuchs Gold Turtle. At least 3 witnesses observed the man approach 23-year-old juvenile court worker Janice Ann Oteet and were convinced that Oteet followed him off the beach. 4 hours later, 19-year-old college student Denise Marie Naslund left the picnic site to go to the restroom and never returned. According to Ted, Janice was alive when he abducted her and forced her to watch him murder Denise. However, on his deathbed, he retracted this account. Subsequently, the Washington State Patrol created a sketch of the suspect and his vehicle based on the description provided. This sketch was then distributed via flyers by local newspapers and television stations. Ted's colleagues, Anne Rugg, his romantic partner Meg, and a University of Washington psychology professor all identified the sketches and informed the police that the suspect might be Ted. However, the detectives, who were inundated with upwards of 200 tips daily, determined that a seasoned student with no criminal history and a comprehensive understanding of the law would not be the perpetrator of such heinous crimes, and thus chose not to pursue the case further. On September 6, 1974, two hunters were engaged in hunting activities when they made the discovery of human remains, which were subsequently identified as those of Denise and Janice, situated in close proximity to a road approximately 3 miles east of Lake Sammamish State Park. In addition to the aforementioned remains, the scene also yielded several additional femurs and vertebrae, which were subsequently identified as belonging to the same individual. Ted was identified as the remains of another missing person, Jorgen Huggins. 6 months later, the skulls of Linda, Susan, and Brenda were discovered by forestry students from Green River Community College on Mount Taylor, located to the east of Issaquah. However, the remains of another victim, Donna, were never recovered. In August 1974, Ted, who had received an acceptance letter from the University of Utah Law School, relocated to Salt Lake City, thereby concluding his homicidal activities in Washington, D.C. However, he maintained contact with acquaintances in Seattle and continued to engage in romantic relationships with several women, including Meg and Carol. In September of that year, Ted initiated a new series of homicides, which included 2 cases that remained unsolved until just before his death. By the end of 1974, Ted had murdered at least 6 women, with a significant reduction in the age range of his victims. This included 4 17-year-old high school girls, including Melissa Smith, the 17-year-old daughter of the chief of the Midvale Police Department in suburban Salt Lake City. However, he also made one misstep. When an operator named Carol Derrick was lured into the vehicle by Ted, she immediately put up a fight after realizing that something was amiss. She then managed to open the door and jump out of the car to escape. In November of that year, Meg again reported Ted to the police after reading newspaper articles about the disappearance of young women around Salt Lake City. By this time, Ted's suspicions had been heightened. However, witnesses at Lake Sammamish State Park were unsuccessful in identifying him in a photo book, and there was insufficient forensic evidence to link Ted to the case. In 1975, Ted relocated the majority of his criminal activities to the eastern United States, specifically to Colorado. On January 12th of that year, Karen Irene Campbell, a 23-year-old registered nurse, vanished from the Wildwood Inn, where she had checked in while on vacation in the village of Snowmass, located southeast of Salt Lake City. 1 month later, the remains of Karen were discovered on the side of a dirt road outside of the village. They were naked and exhibited evidence of sharp-edged lacerations, as well as a blunt force injury to the head, which was determined to be the cause of death. The Karen Campbell case marked a significant turning point in the investigation, as her hair was discovered in Ted's vehicle, providing the first tangible evidence to prosecute him. From January 12th to early May, Ted committed 4 murders in Colorado and Idaho, including the Karen case. The victims were 26-year-old ski instructor Julie Cunningham, 25-year-old Denise Lynn Oliverson, and 12-year-old Lynette Doan Carver. In mid-May 1975, 3 D co-workers, including Carol, traveled to Salt Lake City to visit Ted. They stayed at his apartment for approximately 1 week. Subsequently, Ted returned to Seattle in early June, again for approximately 1 week. On June 28th of the same year, Susan Curtis, a student at Brigham Young University, went missing in Provo, which is located 45 miles south of Salt Lake City. The Susan Curtis case was the final murder for which Ted confessed, and he recorded his confession prior to his execution. With the exception of Melissa Smith and another victim in the Salt Lake City area, Laura Ann M., the remains of the majority of Ted's victims in Utah, Colorado, and Idaho were never recovered, as they were largely discarded in rivers in close proximity to him or interred in exceedingly remote locations. On August 16, 1975, Ted was apprehended by Utah Highway Patrol Troop Bob Hayward in the Salt Lake City suburb of Suwannee. Hayward had observed Ted driving erratically in a residential neighborhood during the early morning hours and subsequently pursued the vehicle at high speed after spotting a patrol car. Trooper Hayward confiscated a ski mask, a second mask fashioned from stockings, a crowbar, a bundle of ropes, an ice axe, handcuffs, garbage bags, and other items from the vehicle. Ted provided an explanation for the items, stating that the mask was for skiing, The handcuffs were retrieved from a dumpster, and the remainder were ordinary household items. In the course of searching Ted's apartment, the police discovered a guidebook to Colorado ski resorts, which bore a checkmark indicating that the Wildwood Lodge had been visited. As the evidence against Ted was insufficient to justify his detention, the police required him to post bail. However, Ted subsequently confessed that the police who searched his apartment had overlooked the photographs of the victims that he had taken with his Polaroid camera, which he promptly destroyed after posting bail. In September 1975, Ted sold his golden turtle to a teenager in the Midvale area. The Utah State Police promptly impounded the vehicle, which was dismantled and meticulously examined by the FBI. During this process, investigators discovered Karen Campbell's hair and trace evidence of Melissa Smith associated with survivor Carol Dirac. In November of that year, the 3 prosecutors responsible for overseeing the Ted-related cases convened a meeting in Aspen, Colorado. Approximately 30 detectives and prosecutors from 5 states were invited to attend. The meeting constituted an essential preliminary stage in the investigation of the Ted case, as state law enforcement officials exchanged and consolidated the available evidence and were convinced that Ted was the perpetrator they sought, but that they required further evidence to secure a conviction. In February 1976, Ted was tried for the disappearance of Carol Dirac. He waived his right to a jury trial, as advised by his attorneys, due to the considerable public interest in the case and the potential detrimental impact of a jury. Following a 4-day trial, Judge Stuart Hansen, Jr. found Ted guilty of kidnapping and sentenced him to 15 years imprisonment. In the same month, the authorities in Utah filed a murder charge against Ted for the crime committed against Karen Campbell. After a brief period of incarceration, Ted was transferred to Aspen, Colorado, where he was to stand trial. Prior to his final apprehension in February 1978, he had already achieved 2 instances of successful prison evasion. The first of these occurred on June 7, 1977, when Ted was conveyed from Garfield Jail in Glenwood Springs he was transported to the Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen, 40 miles away, for his preliminary hearing. He did not hire an attorney, choosing instead to represent himself, and was therefore exempted from handcuffs and shackles by the judge. During a recess in the proceedings, Ted requested access to the courthouse library to conduct research on the case. He then utilized a bookshelf to obstruct the bailiff's view and subsequently exited the second-floor window, sustaining a sprained ankle upon landing. Subsequently, Ted proceeded through the downtown Aspen area, ultimately reaching Aspen Mountain, a location situated on the city's outskirts. There, he gained access to a hunting cabin, procured various items including clothing, sustenance, and firearms, and spent the subsequent night within the cabin. The following day, he continued his journey in a southerly direction. He attempted to reach Crested Butte, a small town located to the south of Aspen. However, he became disoriented and lost in the woods. After wandering aimlessly for 2 days, on June 10th, Ted reached Chestnut Lake, situated 16 miles south of Aspen. He broke into a camping trailer and stole food and a coat. Instead of continuing south, Ted proceeded north and back in the direction of Aspen. 3 days later, he procured a vehicle on the periphery of the Aspen golf course, where the combined effects of cold, hunger, and an ankle injury were becoming increasingly debilitating. Having been on the run for 6 days, Ted returned to Aspen in the stolen vehicle and was observed and apprehended by 2 police officers conducting patrol duty. Police recovered a map of the mountains near Aspen that was used by prosecutors to mark the location where Karen Campbell's remains were found in the car. This evidence proved that the escape was not impromptu but rather premeditated. Upon his return to Glenwood Springs Prison, Ted was encouraged by friends and legal counsel to remain calm until his trial. By this time, a significant portion of the extensive evidence presented to the court by the Colorado prosecution had already been deemed invalid by the court, and Ted's attorney were confident that if he did not create further complications, he could be acquitted in approximately 18 months. They believed that a setback for the Colorado prosecution would prompt other state prosecutors to reconsider their position. However, Ted devised a new scheme for a second prison break. Over the following 6 months, he purchased hacksaw blades and prison floor plans from other inmates and enlisted the assistance of his girlfriend Carol to facilitate the smuggling of some of the prison's contraband during a prison visit. Ted accumulated $500 in cash from the sale of contraband within the prison, then utilized the sound created by other inmates in the shower to saw a roughly 1 square foot hole in his cell ceiling. This allowed him to lose 16 pounds, which enabled him to squeeze through the hole. In the following weeks, Ted continued to utilize the nocturnal hours to investigate the ceiling and identify potential escape routes. During this period, unusual sounds emanating from the ceiling were reported by inmates, yet they were not deemed a significant concern by the guards. In the latter part of 1977, Ted filed a motion to change the venue of the trial to Denver, on the grounds that the case had already received undue attention in Aspen. This motion was granted by the trial judge. On the evening of December 30th of that year, Ted exploited the fact that the majority of the prison staff had departed for Christmas celebrations and were understaffed to create a mock sleeping dummy using books, clothing, and blankets in his bed. He then proceeded to enter the unoccupied warden's office through the ceiling, don the warden's replacement attire, and subsequently depart the prison through the front entrance. After departing the prison, Ted procured a vehicle and proceeded to leave Glenwood Springs. However, the vehicle soon ceased functioning on Interstate 70, necessitating assistance. A passerby offered Ted a lift to the nearby town of Vail, situated 97 miles away. Subsequently, Ted transferred to a bus in Vail, which transported him to Denver, where he boarded an early morning flight to Chicago. Prison officials at Glenwood Springs Prison were not aware of Ted's escape until noon on December 31st. By that time, he had already reached Chicago. Upon arriving in Chicago, Ted proceeded to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where he procured lodging at a local tavern for the purpose of recuperating and surveying his surroundings. Subsequently, 5 days later, Ted procured a vehicle and proceeded to Atlanta, the capital of Georgia, where he transferred to a bus and ultimately arrived in Tallahassee, the capital of Florida. On January 8th, Ted procured lodging at the Holiday Inn in the vicinity of Florida State University under the assumed name of Chris Hagen. According to Ted's subsequent confession, his initial objective was to secure employment, cognizant that as long as he did not attract the attention of the police, he would enjoy a prolonged period of freedom. However, upon recognizing that the majority of conventional employment opportunities necessitated the presentation of identification, he was compelled to abandon this strategy. Consequently, he resorted to larceny once more, resorting to this practice in order to sustain his expenditure. On January 15, 1978, approximately 1 week after Ted's arrival in Tallahassee, he gained access to Chi Omega, the Florida State University chapter house of a prominent sorority organization, through a rear entrance. There, he perpetrated the homicides of Margaret Bowman, age 21, and Lisa Levy, age 20, and inflicted severe injuries upon Kathy Kleiner and Karen Chandler in the adjacent dormitory room. Kathy subsequently attributed their survival to the sudden illumination of their dormitory room by the headlights of a passing vehicle, which caused Ted to flee in terror. Subsequent to departing from Chi Omega's clubhouse, Ted gained access to a basement apartment situated 8 blocks away. There, he proceeded to assault Cheryl Thomas, an FSU student who resided at the aforementioned location. The attack resulted in Thomas sustaining a dislocated shoulder, 5 fractured bones throughout her body, and ultimately necessitating the cessation of her dance career due to the irreversible consequences of her injuries, including permanent deafness and brain damage. Subsequently, a semen stain was discovered on Cheryl's bed, accompanied by a stocking mask containing 2 hairs believed to belong to Ted. However, at the time, the police lacked the requisite investigative techniques to make an accurate match. Consequently, they were only able to test for blood type and other characteristics, which yielded inconclusive results. On February 8, 1978, Ted drove the stolen van 240 miles east to Jacksonville, where he accosted Leslie Parmenter, the 14-year-old daughter of a Jacksonville Police Department detective, in a parking lot. He claimed to be Richard Burton of the fire department, but immediately fled when Leslie's brother arrived on the scene and questioned him. On that day, Ted proceeded to turn back westward, traversing an additional 97 miles to reach Lake City. The following day, Kimberly Diana Ritchie, a 12-year-old female student at Lake City Junior High School, inexplicably vanished after being summoned by her instructor to retrieve a misplaced item. An exhaustive search was subsequently conducted, resulting in the discovery of Kimberly's remains 7 weeks later in a hog barn situated in proximity to the Suwannee River State Park. The cause of death was determined to be a fatal stabbing to the neck. On February 12th, Ted, in a hurry because he lacked the requisite funds to meet his rental obligations, and because he believed that a police investigation was imminent, procured a vehicle and fled Tallahassee, heading westward toward the Florida Narrows. 3 days later, Pensacola police officer David Lee initiated a traffic stop near a cordon set up by the state of Alabama, suspecting that the vehicle in question was stolen. Upon being informed by David that he was about to be arrested, Ted initiated an assault on the officer and subsequently attempted to evade apprehension. David discharged a warning shot and then initiated a pursuit, during which Ted attempted to seize David's sidearm. Ultimately, David was able to subdue Ted and effect his arrest. Police later recovered 3 student IDs belonging to female FSU students, 21 stolen credit cards, a television, a pair of flat black-rimmed glasses, and a pair of plaid pants from Ted's stolen vehicle. The latter 2 items were revealed to be props he had utilized while assuming the identity of Richard Burton from the fire department. David was unaware that he had arrested one of the FBI's 10 most wanted criminals when he sent Ted to prison. The only reason he had arrested Ted was because Ted had said, "I hope you kill me." In June 1979, Ted was tried in Miami for the Chiomega homicide and assault. The case attracted significant media attention, with nearly 250 journalists from around the world following the proceedings. It was the first televised trial in the United States. Despite the provision of 5 public defenders by the court, Ted assumed a significant role in the defense himself. Nelson, one of the lawyers assigned to him, later asserted that from the outset, Ted undermined the entire defense out of malice, distrust, and grandiose delusions of grandeur. Facing a grave charge of murder with the potential for a death sentence, Ted's primary objective was to retain control over the proceedings. Another public defender, Mike Minerva, states that following negotiations, a plea bargain was reached. Ted pleaded guilty to the murders of Margaret Bowman, Lisa Levy, and Kimberly Diana Ritchie in exchange for a 75-year prison sentence. The prosecutors were amenable to the deal because the evidence was insufficient and there was a chance of losing the case. Conversely, Ted viewed the plea bargain as a strategic means of avoiding the death penalty, thereby affording him more time to identify potential weaknesses in the evidence and to withdraw his plea and seek an acquittal should the case evolve in his favor. Nevertheless, Ted declined to negotiate at the 11th hour. According to Minerva, this was because he had come to recognize that he would eventually be compelled to acknowledge his guilt in public, a prospect he was unable to face. The most significant testimony presented during the trial was that of Chiomega member Connie Hastings, who was delayed in arriving at her place of employment and observed Ted exiting the Chiomega clubhouse with the murder weapon in his possession. The direct forensic evidence presented in the case was a bite wound on the left buttock of Lisa Levy, caused by Ted. This evidence was corroborated by the testimony of forensic odontologists Richard Sauveron and Lowell Levine, who demonstrated that a bite mark on the wound matched a molded cast of Ted's teeth. Following the presentation of the closing arguments, the jury engaged in deliberations for a period of 7 hours, ultimately reaching a verdict on July 24, 1979. Ted was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, specifically the deaths of Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy, as well as 3 counts of attempted first-degree murder, pertaining to the murders of Kathy Kleiner, Karen Chandler, and Cheryl Thomas. Given the guilty verdicts rendered in the 2 burglary cases, Judge Edward Coward imposed a sentence of death for the aforementioned murders. 6 months later, Ted was tried in Orlando for the murder of Kimberly Diana Ritchie. The jury deliberated for 8 hours and found him guilty. The evidence in this case was more direct, with witnesses observing Ted approaching his stolen FSU truck with Kimberly in tow, and with fibers recovered from the truck and on Kimberly's remains matching the jacket Ted was wearing at the time of his arrest. At the final judgment, Ted cited a statute that is somewhat unconventional in nature. This statute states that a declaration of marriage in a courtroom automatically constitutes a legal marriage in the presence of a judge. Prior to questioning former co-worker Carol, who had already relocated to Florida on his behalf, and testified on his behalf as a character witness in both trials, Ted opened his mouth to question her. When Ted proposed to Carol in court, she accepted his proposal. Thereafter, Ted declared to the court that they were legally married. The sentencing hearing took place on February 10, 1980, and the court imposed a 3rd death sentence on Ted. In October 1981, Carol gave birth to a baby girl and registered Ted as the father. Florida State Prison does not allow spousal visits, but inmates are said to engage in illicit activities with guards to gain access to female visitors. Following the conclusion of the Rich case, Ted initiated a comprehensive appeal. Concurrently, he was subjected to questioning by members of the press, law enforcement, and government agencies upon request. To avoid becoming a witness in court, Ted spoke in a 3rd person when confronted with these questions, disclosing his early offenses and the process of his change of mind. As he recounted, he began stealing at an early age, a fact that confirmed Meg's suspicion that she had frequently lost items during the course of their relationship. According to Ted's account, possessions were also a significant motivator for rape and murder. Ted stated that sexual assault fulfilled his need to own his victims completely. Initially, killing the victim was merely an expedient method for him to avoid being apprehended, but subsequently, murder became an integral aspect of the experience. And the ultimate form of possession is the taking of a life. Ted stated that he considered himself an amateur during his early years, an impulsive killer who did not enter what he referred to as the predator phase until the 1974 murder of Linda Ann Healy. The confession suggests that Ted may have initiated homicides prior to 1974. However, due to his refusal to provide further details, this remains unconfirmed. In July 1984, corrections officers at the Florida State Penitentiary discovered 2 hacksaw blades concealed within Ted's cell. The steel bar affixed to the cell window had been severed from both ends and subsequently affixed with homemade adhesive composed of soap, and Ted was relocated to an alternative cell. In the subsequent months, prison guards discovered additional unauthorized items in his cell, prompting another transfer. Soon thereafter, he was disciplined for communicating privately with another well-known offender, John Hinckley. In October 1984, Ted commenced composing missives to Robert David Cape. Robert, who had previously served as a principal detective and had recovered a considerable number of crucial statements and eyewitnesses in the Lake Sammamish State Park case, then conducted a comprehensive screening of a multitude of suspects and eventually formulated a suspect list comprising 25 individuals, of whom Ted was one. Robert attempted to conduct an interview with Ted, but was unsuccessful. Robert did not have another opportunity to speak with Ted until his first arrest. Following Ted's arrest, Robert resumed his studies at the University of Washington, pursuing a doctorate while simultaneously serving as a principal researcher for the Washington State Attorney General's office. In 1984, Robert was appointed to participate in the investigation of the Green River Killer case. In response, Ted wrote him a letter in which he analyzed the psychology of serial killers and expressed his hope of being able to assist him in his case. These letters led to an interview, during which Ted confessed to an unidentified murder. In early 1986, the scheduled date for the execution of the perpetrator of the Chi Omega murders was announced initially as March 4th. However, this was subsequently stayed by the U.S. Supreme Court. In April of that year, a new execution date was announced for July 2nd. Following the announcement of the execution date, Ted provided further details of his crimes, including the fact that he would kill his victims and then commit multiple acts of rape until the bodies were too decomposed to do so. Additionally, he would apply makeup and wash the body's hair. At least 12 of his victims were decapitated with a hacksaw, and he would retain the severed heads for a period of time before disposing of them. This would explain why the remains of the victims found on M.T. Taylor consisted only of skulls and a few other bones. On July 1st, 1986, less than 15 hours before the scheduled execution, the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit announced an indefinite stay of execution and remanded the Chi Omega murder case for the United States District Court for the Northern District of Florida to review a number of procedural errors at the preliminary hearing. These included a reassessment of the defendant's mental fitness to stand trial and the trial judge's erroneous interference in jury empanelment. The scheduled date for the execution of Rich's sentence was set for November 18th and was likewise postponed indefinitely by the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals on November 17th. In the end, the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Florida rejected all of the arguments presented and declined to reopen the case at the behest of the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. In the aftermath of the unsuccessful appeal, the Florida prosecution promptly announced a definitive execution date of January 24, 1989. Given that all avenues of appeal had been exhausted, Ted agreed to be more forthcoming with investigators. He admitted to Robert Tam that he had committed 8 murders in Washington and Oregon, and that he was originally the prime suspect in those murders. However, he also described 3 previously unknown victims and 2 victims he had abducted in Oregon and brought to Washington to kill, but he refused to identify any of the 5 victims. Furthermore, Ted provided a comprehensive account of his abduction of Jorgen Hudgens in an alleyway in downtown Washington. He also disclosed information to detectives from Idaho, Utah, and Colorado regarding multiple homicides that had not been previously disclosed to the authorities. However, his approach shifted when he confessed to the crimes but declined to provide further details. This was due to Ted's intention to postpone the execution by remaining the sole individual with knowledge of the body's whereabouts. Once it became evident that the judicial system was unable to provide further assistance, Ted's supporters initiated a final effort to secure executive clemency. Diana Weiner, the young attorney who was the last person Ted interacted with, has been attempting to persuade several family members of the victims in Colorado and Utah to petition Florida Governor Robert Martinez to allow Ted additional time to divulge further information. However, these requests have been rejected. In his subsequent written account, Nelson states that the families of the victims have come to terms with the reality of their loved ones' deaths at the hands of Ted, and that they no longer require a confession from him. However, Carol, who had maintained her belief in Ted's innocence throughout the trials, felt betrayed when Ted began to plead guilty. As a result, she relocated to Washington, D.C. with her daughter and declined to accept any further phone calls from Ted on the morning of the execution. Since his initial arrest, Ted had consistently denied any involvement in the crimes for which he was charged. It was only after he had exhausted all avenues of appeal and was facing the death penalty that he finally admitted to committing at least 30 murders. In light of Ted's confession regarding at least 10 additional unidentified murders, the actual number of victims remains uncertain. Media speculation ranges from 26 to 100, while caseworkers estimate the figure to be approximately 35. On January 24, 1989, at 7:16 a.m. EST, Ted was executed by electrocution in the electric chair at Florida's Rehoboth prison. During the execution, a multitude of individuals engaged in celebratory activities, including singing, partying, setting off fireworks on the adjacent ranch, and cheering loudly as the white limousine transporting Ted's remains departed the prison grounds. Subsequent to cremation in Gainesville, Ted's ashes were scattered at a confidential location in the Cascade Mountains of Washington State, in accordance with his written instructions.
Paul Bernardo has been selected as one of the notorious serial killers in Canadian history. Although he committed a series of rapes in Canada between 1987 and 1990, with at least 12 rapes and 4 attempted rapes, he was also involved in at least 3 murders, but he wasn't really a serial killer. He was a lustful demon made by an acquired influence. Paul Bernardo was never cut out to be a killer. It was just his perception that was altered in the home environment he grew up in. A person's upbringing determines what kind of person they will become in the future. An example of this would be if your father was a carpenter, then over the years you might also be interested in carpentry as a career. Paul Bernardo was born into a very bad family. His mother, Marilyn, and was adopted at a young age by a lawyer from Toronto, Canada. The family loved Marilyn so much that they always treated him well. But growing up in this coddled environment, Marilyn would think that everything was perfectly fine, so she meets her husband, Kenneth Bernardo, who grew up in another unfortunate family. Kenneth's father was a successful businessman, but he was not a good father or husband, because whenever he had a little setback in business, then he would beat his wife and children. As a result, Kenneth got into a bad habit, which is that he would treat young women with a morbid mentality. In 1960, Marilyn's boyfriend asked her to marry him, but her father refused because he had failed the so-called son-in-law test. But even the most successful people make mistakes. Marilyn's father had put Marilyn in Kenneth's trap just because Kenneth had passed the son-in-law test. Marilyn and Kenneth married in 1960 and settled in a middle-class neighborhood in the Scarborough area of Toronto, Canada, a beautiful community, but Marilyn and Kenneth's marriage was not a good one. They fought, and Kenneth would beat Marilyn just because he was like his father. Kenneth, like his father, would bully his wife whenever things didn't go his way. Marilyn was a very naive person who thought that she would be happy by going along with Kenneth, but she was proven wrong. Even after she gave birth to Kenneth's child, Kenneth didn't stop his bad behavior. Eventually, Marilyn ran away from the marriage. She cheated on her ex-boyfriend and gave birth to a child, but Kenneth was not repulsed by Marilyn's behavior. It didn't even matter to him. He tolerated Marilyn's infidelity and volunteered to be the child's biological father on the birth certificate. In August 1964, they named the child Paul Bernardo. And while Paul was growing up, his father, Kenneth, continued to harass young girls. He would hang out in the neighborhood at night, tailing young girls and peeking out windows to watch them change clothes, for which he was taken to court. But the worst was when he began sexually abusing his young daughter. And Paul's mother, Marilyn, who became self-absorbed because of her husband's beatings as well as her mind control, would overeat to the point that she became very obese. And because of her obesity, her depression became worse, so she stopped taking care of her family as well as her children, and instead hid herself in the basement of the house. And Paul lived in such a bad environment. He was originally a very friendly little boy who was happy every moment, especially when he smiled he would have dimples. So much so that many women would unconsciously pinch his cheeks every time they saw him, and to them Paul was just a very perfect child. Because Paul was polite and did well in school, especially when he was very cute in his Boy Scout uniform. Later, as he grew up, Paul would keep attending events, so he was the favorite in the hearts of the kids around him. Teenage girls also adored him because of his angelic appearance and shy, likable demeanor. The girls who dated Paul when he was in high school also thought Paul was a very considerate person. Intellectually, Paul was even better. He was smart, worked hard at his studies, and took on a number of school positions to take care of a range of after-school tasks. This was Paul's happiest time until, at the age of 16, he got into an argument with his mother, and Marilyn angrily said to Paul, "Who do you think you are? You're just an asshole, and you're not your father's real son?" After Paul saw the picture of his real father, his mind went blank, like a bullet hit his brain. After this, Paul's thoughts changed, and he began to mock his mother, calling her very sloppy and even saying that she was a whore. Because Paul realized his mother's unfaithfulness and his father's sick behavior, he began to hate his parents. So Paul started to hang out with some bad boys, and this had a very negative effect on his thinking. Paul followed them and stole and bullied girls together, and after this Paul's attitude towards women changed dramatically. Before, Paul would treat the girls gently and considerately, and after this he would order them to do something bad, and if they didn't agree, then Paul would verbally abuse as well as beat them. Around 1980, Paul graduated from Sir Wilfrid Laurier College. Paul and his friends were recruited by Amway, an American marketing company. And Paul learned a lot from this job, such as sales and business aspects and interpersonal relations. He also bought a lot of books and tapes from famous experts. At this time, Paul was all about making money, but it didn't last long. Paul left Amway after working for a while. When Paul stayed with his punk friends, they would go to the bar every night and drink. If there were some pretty girls who were attracted to their douchebaggery, they would lie to those naive girls that they were rich. And this lie would attract those naive girls, and then they would voluntarily sleep with Paul and the others. By the time Paul was studying at the University of Scarborough in Toronto, his mind had become distorted, and his temper had become so violent that he would seek out gentle girls for dates, humiliate them in public, and beat them up when he was in a bad mood. Paul also sells stolen goods. His friends rob passers-by in stores, and then Paul sells them at the university. Because Paul's desire for money is so powerful, no job's paycheck will allow him to squander it. So Paul starts a scam in which he swears to get a lot of money, but luckily no one is fooled. By the time Paul graduates from college, Paul takes a job as a junior accountant in order to make ends meet. And his girlfriend, tired of being tied up and beaten, breaks up with Paul. Paul, who was initiated by the girl to mention the breakup, felt angry because he was a controlling macho man, so he began to decide to take revenge on society. On May 4th, 1987, a 21-year-old girl was followed by Paul while she was riding a bus home late at night. She was walking alone on a late-night street, which was illuminated by streetlights as the girl made her way home, but Paul attacked her for half an hour. It was Paul's first attack and a nightmarish experience for the girl. On May 14, 1987, as if Paul had tasted a delicacy, he attacked a 19-year-old girl again, and the place of commission was in the backyard of a house. The girl panicked and called for help, but no one rescued her during that hour or so. On July 27, 1987, it was as if Paul was obsessed with the feeling of the girl's constant struggles and cries beneath him. He tried to carry out a third attack. Paul found a girl by the side of the street in the middle of the night, who was preparing to go home. He first assaulted the girl, trying to get her to follow him, but after the girl fought back, he got scared and then gave up the attack. On September 29, 1987, Paul again attempted to assault a 15-year-old girl by being so bold as to break into the girl's house illegally and then quietly enter her bedroom. The girl was sleeping, but Paul woke her up by sitting on top of her, and when she tried to cry out for help, Paul covered her mouth with his hand and then took out a knife and threatened the girl. And sensing something was wrong, the girl's mother, she entered the room and found Paul. Then when she was about to scream out loud, Paul fled. In October 1987, Paul met the girl of his dreams, a beautiful blonde called Karla Homolka, 17 years old, and in that year Paul was 23 years old. When they meet, it's like Cupid's arrow has hit them both because they almost immediately take an interest in each other. Unlike the girls Paul had met before, Karla was totally supportive of Paul's idea of assaulting others and was totally okay with being abused by Paul. Karla was born in 1970 in Port Credit Hare, Ontario, Canada, to Karol Homolka, a traveling salesman and Czechoslovakian immigrant with a penchant for heavy drinking, and his wife, Dorothy Homolka, an employee of a geriatric clinic. She has two sisters, Lori and Tammy. Karla is a bright child and a good student, and her father loves her, but he also insults her and her mother and sisters when he is drunk. Almost all murderers will have an unfortunate family, a father who likes to beat his family and a mother who doesn't love her children. Living in this type of environment, Karla's temperament was also influenced by her father, and she became stubborn and overbearing, unable to get along with other children, yet she would socialize with people older than her, and this was a sick mentality because she enjoyed being abused. When Karla was in middle school, she experienced a depressive episode, and during that time she would dress in strange costumes and then hurt herself with a knife, and when she was caught by her parents, she would say, "I hurt myself just to get your love." During this time period, she had gone down the wrong path, and unfortunately, she didn't get any help from anyone. When Paul and Karla became a couple, Paul drove to see Karla twice a week and slowly took control of her entire life, deciding how she should dress, look, eat, and believe. Especially because Paul was so upset when he found out Karla wasn't a virgin when they first met. Paul's sarcastic comments about Karla being fat and ugly may have been compensatory, but Karla soon succumbed to Paul's mind control, even writing down Paul's instructions on a self-improvement checklist. When Paul and Karla are together, they role-play, with Paul playing the role of a master and Karla playing the role of an abused slave. During the time that these two demons spent together, more than a dozen girls were attacked by them. On December 16, 1987, Paul again attacked a 15-year-old girl. The following day, the Toronto Police Service issued a warning to women in Scarborough, particularly those riding the bus, because they had noticed that the girls were being followed after they got off the bus. On December 23, 1987, Paul attacked a 17-year-old girl again with a knife, threatening her with disfigurement if she wouldn't take it. And from this attack, Paul began to be known as the Scarborough Rapist. On April 18, 1988, a 17-year-old girl was attacked by Paul. On May 25, 1988, Paul was almost caught by a uniformed police officer as he was about to attack a pretty young girl. However, he was spotted by the policeman, and even though he was hiding under a tree, Paul immediately fled after spotting the policeman. On May 30, 1988, Paul again attacked an 18-year-old girl. On October 4, 1988, Paul again stalked a girl, but this time he was not successful because the girl was prepared and she bravely fought with Paul, but because Paul had a knife in his hand, she was stabbed twice by Paul at her thighs, as well as at her buttocks. Luckily, she didn't die, but only received 12 stitches in the wounds. On November 16, 1988, an 18-year-old girl was assaulted. On November 17, 1988, the police formed a task force to capture Paul. But despite a wealth of physical evidence and sketches of the killer that were not shown to the public, the investigation came up empty. And Carla knew what Paul was doing in the meantime. One of the victims claimed that Carla was present at the attack and recorded it on video camera, but the allegations were ignored by the police. On December 27, 1988, Paul's attack failed because a nearby neighbor chased Paul away at that time. On June 20, 1989, Paul's attack failed, and it was another brave girl who struggled with Paul before her screams caused a nearby neighbor to run away with scratches on Paul's face. On August 15, 1989, a 22-year-old girl was attacked. On November 21, 1989, Paul attacked a 15-year-old girl at a bus shelter. On December 22, 1989, Paul assaulted a 19-year-old girl. On May 26, 1990, Paul again attacked a 19-year-old girl. After so many victims appeared, the police published sketches of the killer in Toronto and the surrounding area and provided a great deal of information in order to prevent any more victims. Between May and September 1990, police collected DNA test samples from more than 130 suspects when they received 2 reports that the killer they were looking for was Paul Bernardo. The first was submitted by a bank employee. The second was submitted by the wife of one of Paul's closest friends, who told police that Paul had been set up as a suspect in a previous assault investigation, but that he had never been questioned and that he would often talk to people around him about his sick ideas. And when the police received this report, they weren't sure if they were going to take it seriously, but after examining both reports, they decided to question Paul. On November 20, 1990, the police formally questioned Paul. When the police mentioned Paul as to why he was being investigated, Paul admitted that it was suspicious that he looked like the killer's sketch. The police then concluded that they thought it was unlikely that such a well-educated young man would commit a crime, and Paul volunteered to give blood, saliva, and hair samples. And the interrogation, which lasted 35 minutes, ended with the police ruling that Paul was not the murderer. After the interrogation, Paul and Carla got engaged, and to celebrate this special day, Carla did something that outraged everyone. For she volunteers to give Paul her 15-year-old sister's virginity as a Christmas present. However, Paul is also very happy with this offer. Paul hatches a plan where he asks Carla to use drugs to knock out her sister Tammy that night, and also asks Carla to make sure that Tammy is a virgin at all times. Carla does a great job. She acts like a strict father and forbids any boys to come near Tammy. In Tammy's mind, she thinks that Carla is being nice to her, but the truth is, what she doesn't realize is that Carla is actually treating her like a commodity. Then, on a summer trip, Carla is ready to make her move, stealing a lot of sleeping pills from Tammy's workplace in order to knock her out. That night, she cooks a meal and puts some sleeping pills in it. After eating, Tammy did fall asleep, but only for a minute. On December 23rd, after Christmas dinner, Carla put a handful of sleeping pills in Tammy's drink, and the amount would put a cow to sleep. By the time Tammy started complaining about why her head was so dizzy, Paul and Carla had a strange smile on their faces because they knew in their hearts that the plan was about to be executed. And a few minutes later, Paul got the result he wanted. And Tammy woke up from the pain, but just as she was still thinking, Carla took a halothane-soaked rag and covered Tammy's mouth and nose. Tammy struggled with the pain and she kept trying to vomit. Carla continued to cover Tammy's mouth, and after a few minutes, Tammy stopped breathing. After Paul and Carla realized that Tammy had stopped breathing, they tried cardiac resuscitation, but it didn't work. Tammy was dead. So they set out to eliminate the evidence. They dressed Tammy and put her body in her bed. Because as soon as the autopsy was done, the coroners would realize it was a murder. So they disguised the scene as an accidental death. Then they called the police and claimed that Tammy choked to death on her own vomit. When the police arrived, although they noticed mysterious chemical burns on Tammy's face, the drugs in her system were not detected, and believing that the family would never murder a family member, the police concluded that Tammy's death was an accident. At Tammy's funeral, Paul did a very disgusting thing. He kept touching Tammy, who was lying in the casket. They even put a picture of them in the casket. 3 weeks after Tammy's death, Carla and Bernardo filmed a video called Fireside Chat at the Homolka residence. The video was ultimately considered as evidence in court because it began in the basement recreation room, and at some point the filming moved to Tammy's bedroom. While they were in the recreation room, Carla admitted to Paul that she liked it when Paul attacked Tammy, and she also said in the video that she wanted to leave a rose at Tammy's grave. In Paul and Carla's subsequent role-playing sessions, Carla would even dress up in Tammy's clothes to play the part of her poor sister. Paul was a demon of sexual desire, and Carla was like a believer who was voluntarily compelled by the demon. Shortly after Tammy's funeral, Carla's parents leave town and her other sister, Lori, goes to Mississauga to visit her grandparents. The house was empty at this time, just Paul and Carla, so they decided to do something about it. On January 12, 1991, a beautiful weekend, Paul went out hunting early in the morning, and a few hours later, a girl was kidnapped and brought home by Paul, who then attacked the girl while Carla watched. On April 6, 1991, Paul continued his attacks, this time in St. Catharines, Canada. At approximately 5:30 a.m., Paul abducted a 14-year-old girl. This attack was different from the previous one because Carla was also involved in the attack. The girl was in training at the time, but Carla kept waving at her from her car. When the girl approached, Paul immediately grabbed her and dragged her to a bush on the side of the road and attacked her. On June 7, 1991, Carla invited to the party a 15-year-old girl known as Jane Doe, a friend whom Carla had met 2 years earlier at a pet store. During this time, Carla had been taking Jane shopping as well as eating, after which she took Jane to a bar for drinks. When Jane got drunk, Carla immediately called Paul and asked him to come over and help bring the girl home, as Jane was Carla's wedding gift to Paul. By the time Jane woke up the next morning, she felt sore and weak, but she didn't think it was strange because it was her first time drinking. She just thought it was a side effect of being drunk and didn't realize in the slightest that she had been attacked. And Jane's story with the couple didn't end there. In August, she was once again invited by Carla, and then once again she was knocked out and once again attacked. On December 22, 1992, Jane visited the couple once again, and this time Carla forced her to have sex with Paul, after which she left distraught. Leslie Erin Manhefi, one of the 3 victims murdered by Paul and Carla, was born on July 5, 1976. She was born in the United States of America. Her father was an oceanographer with the Canadian Federal Department of Fisheries and Oceans and was sometimes away from home for weeks at a time. Her mother, on the other hand, was a teacher. On the evening of June 14th, Leslie went to the funeral home to attend the wake of her friend Chris Evans, who had died in a car accident earlier in the week. After the wake, a group of teens met in the woods to comfort each other. A couple of her friends gave her a ride home just before 2 a.m. and decided to stay with her when they realized the side door was locked. Leslie told them the front door would be open and let them go home. But when Leslie realized that the front door was also locked, she walked to a payphone in a nearby plaza and called her friends to ask for a place to stay, which was denied. After a lengthy conversation, she said she had to go home to wake her mother to get in. On her way home, she met up with Paul, who was in the backyard looking for the victim. After learning that Leslie did not have a place to stay, he lured Leslie back to the car and took her to the house he shared with Carla. Later that day, a friend of Leslie's called Leslie's parents to check on Leslie and explain to them that Leslie had been locked out. Leslie's mother immediately began searching for her daughter, but of all places there was no sign of Leslie, and then on June 18th she filed formal papers requesting that her daughter be notified and arrested as a runaway. What she didn't realize, however, was that her daughter had already been kidnapped by Paul, and all the police could find was her body. During the first 24 hours of Leslie's abduction, Paul and Carla continually beat and assaulted Leslie and gave her a teddy bear to cuddle in between attacks. However, during Leslie's torture, her blindfold fell off and she clearly saw Paul and Carla's faces. So Paul kept strangling Leslie with wires and Carla used sedatives, just as they had done with Tammy's murder earlier, and Leslie died from their torture. Paul and Carla then moved Leslie's body to the basement. During this time, they host Carla's family at their home for Father's Day dinner. When the family leaves, they dismember the body with a circular saw, but that's just not enough. They think the best way to dispose of the evidence is by hiding the body in cement. So the next day, Paul bought a dozen bags of cement at a hardware store. Several trips were then made to Lake Gibson, 18 kilometers south of Port Dalhousie, to drop off the cement blocks. On the evening of June 29, 1991, a man and his wife were canoeing on Gibson Lake when they saw a block of cement while some pieces of meat were wrapped inside. Then, with the help of a fisherman, they pulled the cement block out, and upon closer inspection, inside the block was the calf and foot of a young woman. Soon the place was buzzing because they called the police. And the police found a total of 5 cement blocks dumped in shallow water. Police reasoned that whoever dumped this body in Gibson Lake was unfamiliar with the area, or he would have thrown the cement blocks under the bridge. The body was also identified as Leslie, who had been missing for days, as her distinctive braces provided a clue. On July 28, 1991, after Paul saw 21-year-old Sydney Kirshen while driving home from work, he followed her. He continued to follow her until August 9th. This time, she took evasive action, stopping at her boyfriend's house just before he arrived. Upon spotting Paul, the boyfriend gave chase, saw Paul's gold Nissan, and memorized the license plate. The couple identified the car as belonging to Paul to the Niagara Regional Police. An officer visited Paul's home and saw the car parked in the driveway, but did not pursue the matter or file an official police report. On the afternoon of April 16, 1992, Paul and Carla were still searching for potential victims. It was after school the day before Good Friday. Students were still heading home, but in general the streets were empty. As they passed Holy Cross High School, a major Catholic high school on the north end of the city, they noticed Kristen French, a 15-year-old student, walking down the street. The couple pulled into the parking lot of the nearby Grace Lutheran Church, and Carla got out of the car, map in hand, pretending to need help. While Kristen was concentrating on the map, Paul attacked from behind, brandishing a knife, and then pushed her into the front seat of their car, where Carla took control by pulling Kristen's hair from her back seat. Kristen would take the same route home every day, taking about 15 minutes to get home in order to satisfy her dog. When she didn't arrive home when she was supposed to, her parents became convinced she was in danger and immediately notified police. Within 24 hours, the Niagara Regional Police had assembled a team that searched the area along the route and located several witnesses who had witnessed the abduction from different sides, thus providing the police with a fairly clear picture. Over the course of 3 days over the Easter weekend, Paul and Carla videotaped themselves torturing Kristen and forcing her to drink copious amounts of alcohol to make her obey Paul's orders. And since Paul has long had it in his mind to try to kill her, and since she's never been blindfolded, and she remembers exactly what her kidnappers look like, Paul has no intention of letting her go from the start. The next day, the couple murdered Kristen before going to Easter dinner, when Paul strangled Kristen with an electric wire for a full 7 minutes before letting her die, while Carla watched on, and when Kristen resisted, Carla would beat her with a rubber mallet, and ultimately Kristen died as a result of their torture. On April 30th, 1992, Kristen's body was found in a ditch in Burlington, approximately 45 minutes from St. Her body had been cleaned and her hair had been cut off. The medical examiner found bruises on Kristen's back similar to the blunt force injuries on Leslie's body, and for the first time, police connected the two murders. Police then questioned Paul again on May 12th, based on clues about his propensity for violent and aggressive behavior, and considered him a prime suspect in both Southern Ontario murders. The Niagara Regional Police, in cooperation with the Halton Regional Police, formed a task force to investigate both crimes. On July 21st, a reenactment of Kristen's abduction was shown on television. It generated thousands of tips but no substantial leads. On January 6, 1993, Carla was admitted to St. Catherine's General Hospital after she had been severely beaten by Paul with a flashlight, whereupon Carla accused Paul of assaulting her with a weapon. The police then arrested Paul, but he was soon out on bail, and Carla never returned to her and Paul's home in Port Dalhousie. A month later, the Forensic Science Center finally matched Paul's DNA from 2 years earlier with Scarborough Rapist's DNA, and tests proved that Paul was Scarborough Rapist. After being notified, the police placed Paul under surveillance. Carla was initially uncooperative with the police, and after consulting with her lawyer, she said she would testify against Paul on the condition that she be granted immunity from prosecution. The Attorney General of Ontario did not agree to immunity, but was willing to consider a reduced sentence. On February 17th, Paul was arrested for the murders of Leslie and Kristen, as well as crimes committed by Scarborough Rapist. At first, the police interrogated Carla for 4 days. She blamed Paul for Tammy's death. She described how Paul abducted Leslie from the yard and how she and Paul lured Kristen to the car in the parking lot. She stated that both girls were used as slaves before Paul strangled them. It was also claimed that Paul had bragged to her about attacking at least 30 girls. Carla described herself as a battered wife who was forced to participate in Paul's crimes and lived in fear of him. When police searched their house, they found lists of Scarborough rapes, books of a perverted sexual nature, a hunting knife, handcuffs, and a videotape of Homolka and Bernardo engaging in sexual activity with 2 unidentified young women. So, in the eyes of the police, Carla was clearly a willing participant in both encounters. She admitted to the police that one of the girls had been drugged, and that she was later unaware that she had been assaulted. On July 6, 1993, as part of a plea bargain with prosecutors, Carla was convicted after pleading guilty to 2 counts of manslaughter in the murders of Leslie and Kristen. She was sentenced to 2 12-year prison terms to be served immediately. On the news, Carla appeared as Paul, a co-conspirator, not a scared, forced participant. Jury selection for Paul's trial began on May 1, 1995. The Crown opened its case on May 18th. The trial lasted 4 months, during which time Carla spent 17 days on the witness stand in the courtroom. Paul was found guilty of all charges against him: 2 counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, being held captive, and aggravated sexual assault, and 1 count of defilement of a human body. He was sentenced to life in prison and declared a dangerous offender with a high likelihood of parole. 5 years later, in 2000, both the Ontario Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court of Canada rejected Paul's efforts to appeal his murder conviction, and in 2006, Paul's lawyer indicated that his client had confessed to 10 other sexual assaults in 2005. He has been incarcerated at the Millhaven Maximum Security Prison in Bath, Ontario, since 2013. And while the government's investigation into Paul found that the police had made many mistakes and that competition between police agencies further compromised the investigation, some of Bernardo's crimes might have been prevented if his DNA samples had been processed and matched more quickly. Paul was treated differently by all inmates in prison because he was a serial rapist. For Paul's protection, he was kept in the segregation unit of the prison, but despite this, he was attacked and harassed. On one occasion in 1996, he was punched in the face by another inmate as he returned from a shower. In June 1999, 5 criminals attempted to break into the segregation perimeter where Paul was housed, and a riot squad had to use gas to disperse them. In 2006, Paul was interviewed in prison, stating that he was reformed and would be a good candidate for parole. But looking at the terms, he was ineligible for release in 2010 because he was convicted of multiple murders. He then had his last 2 parole hearings in 2021 as well as in February of this year, but was denied both. Carla Homolka, on the other hand, served her entire 12-year sentence before being released from prison in 2005 under a series of conditions imposed by a judge, including restrictions on her movements and a ban on contact with anyone under the age of 16. Just a few months later, another judge overturned those restrictions, which drew criticism from Leslie and the Kristen family. After her release, she moved to Montreal and has been married and has 3 children. Some reports indicated that she was volunteering at a private school, but this news caused resentment and concern among some parents when it broke in the media. Despite this, the school authorities stated that they were aware of Carla's past and that there were always other people present when she interacted with the children, ensuring that there was no chance of being alone. Furthermore, Carla later moved with her family to the Caribbean island of Guadeloupe and lived under the name Leanne Bourdley, the brother of her prison lawyer. After being discovered by a Canadian journalist, she returned to Quebec. Despite the fact that she has been out of prison for many years, her past continues to generate a great deal of public interest and controversy.